The telegraph operator's hand was shaking when he slid the paper across the counter. Not from cold, not from age, from what was written on it. Gideon Rusk read it once. Then he read it again, slower, as though the second time might change the words. It didn't. Lenora Vance, passenger, deceased, railcar fire, April 12th, manifest confirmed. Outside, Drywater Crossing went about its morning. Horses, wagon wheels, a woman laughing somewhere down the street. Gideon folded the telegram. He pressed it flat against his chest, right over the heart that had, for the first time in 7 years, started feeling something again. Then he walked out into the spring air and said nothing to anyone. If that were you, if the one person you'd finally let yourself want was gone before you ever touched their hand, what would you do next? If this kind of story moves you, subscribe to this channel and follow along to the very end. Hit the like button and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Don't miss what's coming next. Now let's begin. Gideon Rusk had not cried at his wife's funeral. He remembered standing at the grave with his hat in both hands, people pressing against him on all sides, and thinking that the dirt smelled wrong for April. Too dry. Everything in this country was too dry, too fast, too indifferent to what a man needed. Eleanor had been 31 years old. She had been healthy on Monday. She was gone by Saturday. No warning, no time to prepare, no decent chance to say the right things. Just a fever that climbed too fast and a doctor who arrived 2 hours late from the next county over. Gideon had thanked every person who came to the service. He had shaken hands, accepted food. He didn't eat, nodded at condolences that all used the same 6 words in slightly different orders. And when everyone finally cleared out, and the sun dropped behind the ridge and the ranch fell quiet, he had gone into the barn, sat down in the dark corner beside the feed bins, and stayed there until his legs went numb. That was the last time anyone saw Gideon Rusk sit still without a reason. 7 years had passed since that evening. 7 years of deliberately filling every hour from before sunup until well past dark. He repaired fences that didn't need repairing. He reorganized the barn twice. He drove cattle to market and drove himself home in the same straight-backed silence he brought to everything, and the people of Drywater Crossing learned to read him the way you learn to read weather. Useful, reliable, not the kind of thing you tried to talk out of its nature. Gideon doesn't need anything, his nearest neighbor, Walt Purvis, had said once at the hardware store, not unkindly. Man's built himself into a tool. Tools don't get lonesome. The other men at the counter had laughed, the short, polite laugh of people who recognize truth in something uncomfortable. Gideon had been standing behind a rack of bridal hardware when he heard it, and he had not moved, and he had not corrected Walt because Walt was not entirely wrong. He had built something, a functioning life with no soft places left in it. The cattle needed tending, and he tended them. The roof leaked in 3 places, and he fixed all 3. He cooked what he needed to cook, slept when he needed to sleep, and got up the next morning and did it again. There was a discipline to it that he had come to mistake for peace. It wasn't peace. He understood that now. What it was, what it had always been, was a very organized kind of hiding. The winter of 1881 into 1882 was the thing that finally cracked the arrangement. It came early, and it came mean. Not the worst winter the territory had ever seen, but the longest, with a particular quality of gray that pressed down on the land from November straight through to March, without a single honest break. Gideon spent 6 of those months alone at Cinder Ridge, with no company but the cattle and a barn cat named Sargent, who had lost an ear to something years before Gideon acquired him, and clearly did not consider the debt repaid. By February, Gideon had read every book he owned twice, and one of them 3 times. He had inventoried his supplies 4 times. He had repaired tools that were already repaired. He had sat at the kitchen table on 3 separate evenings with a pen and a sheet of paper and nothing particular to write. And on the 3rd evening, he had found himself staring at Eleanor's chair, the one across from him, the one he'd moved to face the corner so he wouldn't have to look at it empty. And the feeling that came over him was not grief exactly. Grief he knew. He was acquainted with grief the way you're acquainted with a difficult neighbor. You know his habits, you know when to expect him. This was something else, smaller and steadier and harder to name. It was the absence of being known by anyone. The distinction mattered. Eleanor had known him, not the version he showed Drywater Crossing, the reliable, close-mouthed rancher who could be counted on but not confided in. The actual version. The one who second-guessed his own decisions for days after making them. The one who got quietly furious at cruelty to animals. The one who had, at 22 years old, cried at a poem in a book he'd borrowed from a school friend and never told a single soul about it. Nobody knew that man anymore. Nobody had known him for 7 years. And somewhere in the grinding gray of February, alone at a table with an empty chair turned toward the wall, Gideon Rusk ran out of reasons to keep hiding him. He found the notice in a newspaper 3 weeks old, folded inside a copy of a St. Louis Gazette someone had left at the Drywater Crossing general store. He almost didn't read it. He nearly used the paper to start the stove, but a headline about cattle prices on the facing page made him unfold it fully, and when he smoothed it flat on the counter, the notice was right there in the far column, modestly sized, unassuming. Western Matrimonial Registry, connecting gentlemen of the frontier with ladies of education and good character seeking purposeful lives. He stood at that counter for a full minute without moving. Then he folded the paper, bought his flour and salt, and drove back to Cinder Ridge. He threw the paper in the fire that same night. He sat up for another 2 hours thinking about it anyway. He wrote to the agency 6 days later. The letter took him 4 drafts. The first was stiff and read like a legal document. The second was too short and sounded either arrogant or frightened. He couldn't decide which. The third veered into explanations about Eleanor that he immediately decided were no one's business. The fourth draft was honest in the quiet, plain-spoken way that Gideon was honest when he let himself be. Not performing modesty, not overstating his situation, just writing the plain facts of his life. And one sentence near the end that had cost him the most to put down. I have not been lonely for company. I have been lonely for a person who might be worth the risk of knowing. He sealed the envelope before he could change his mind about that sentence. The agency wrote back with the name of Lenora Vance. Her first letter arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in early March, and Gideon stood in the yard and read it standing up, because he hadn't been prepared for how immediate it would feel to hear a stranger's actual voice come off a page. Not her speaking voice, he had no way of knowing that, but her thinking voice. The way she moved from one idea to the next, the places where she stopped herself mid-thought and circled back, and the ones where she didn't bother to explain something because she seemed to simply trust that whoever was reading would follow. She was 32. A seamstress in Philadelphia. She had been working in the same shop for 11 years and knew every stitch available to her, and had, she wrote without apparent self-pity, become bored of every single one of them. She had no living parents. One brother who was pleasant but absorbed in his own family. She described her current life with a precision that was borderline brutal. The narrow bedroom, the window that faced a brick wall, the Sunday afternoons that felt identical to every Sunday afternoon before them. I am not looking for rescue, she wrote, and he could feel how carefully she'd chosen that word, the way you feel something carved into wood rather than written in pencil. I am looking for something large enough to be worth failing at. Gideon read that sentence twice. Then he sat down on the porch steps, which he hadn't done since he couldn't remember when, and he read the whole letter again. He wrote back that same evening, longer than he'd intended. He told her about Cinder Ridge, the particular way the East Hill looked in late afternoon light, the logistics of the cattle operation, the fact that the nearest doctor was 18 miles away and the nearest library was further than that, and the winter, the honest truth of how long and dark a frontier winter could be. He was deliberate about not softening it. If she was going to come here, she deserved to know what she was coming to. Then, near the end, almost as an afterthought that wasn't an afterthought at all, he wrote, I don't know what a person looks like who's right for this kind of life, but I think they look like someone who isn't afraid of the dark, just tired of spending it alone. Her second letter arrived 10 days later and was longer than the first. By the third letter, they were not introducing themselves anymore. By the fourth, he had told her about Eleanor. Not the whole of it, just enough. And she had told him about a man in Philadelphia who had seemed like the beginning of something and had turned out to be a very smooth ending instead, and neither of them reached for dramatic language about it. They simply told the truth and let the truth be what it was. By the sixth letter, somewhere in the gray machinery of Gideon's chest, something that had been held tight for 7 years had started, carefully, to unwind. He asked her to come. He enclosed the train fare. She wrote back with one sentence, I will arrive on April 18th. Don't work too hard between now and then. He almost smiled reading it. He caught himself and then decided not to catch himself and smiled anyway, alone in the kitchen of Cinder Ridge, a man who hadn't smiled about anything in recent memory, smiling at a sentence from a woman he'd never met. He started noticing the empty chair differently after that. Not with grief, with something closer to intention. He moved it back to its place across the table. He didn't sleep especially well the next 12 days, which was new. He'd been a sound sleeper for years because sound sleep is easy when nothing is at stake. But now there was something at stake, and at 2 in the morning, when the wind hit the north wall of the house, he lay in the dark and thought about what it would actually mean to have another person in this space. Someone across the breakfast table. Someone whose habits he didn't know yet. Someone who might be disappointed by the reality of Cinder Ridge after the version of it he'd built in letters. That fear was real. He didn't pretend it wasn't. But underneath it was something larger and warmer, a thing he didn't have a word for, but that felt, for lack of better language, like the first signs of something he'd stopped expecting to feel again. On April 12th, 6 days before Lenora was supposed to arrive, Gideon rode into Drywater Crossing for a routine supply run. He stopped at the telegraph office the way he sometimes did, checking for any business wires about the cattle market. The telegraph operator, a young man named Hayes, barely 20, usually cheerful, looked up when Gideon walked in and his face did something strange, a kind of careful flattening, the way faces go when they know they are about to deliver bad news and are bracing for what comes after. "Mr. Rusk," Hayes said. "Morning." Hayes stopped, started again. "There's a wire for you, sir." He slid it across the counter with 2 fingers, the way you'd slide something fragile. Or something dangerous. Gideon picked it up. He read it. Lenora Vance, passenger, deceased. Railcar fire. April 12th. Manifest confirmed. Western Railway Authority. The office was very quiet. Hayes wasn't looking at him. A clock ticked somewhere. Outside, a horse shook its bridle and a woman's voice called out to someone down the street. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a morning that didn't know it was supposed to stop. Gideon read the telegram again. Not because he expected different words, because his mind required a second pass before it would accept what his eyes had already delivered. Lenora Vance, deceased. Railcar fire. She had been on that train. He knew the route she was taking. He had helped her plan it, had suggested which connection would be the most direct, had written out the approximate timeline in his 5th letter. She would be somewhere in Ohio or Indiana by April 12th, depending on weather and schedule. There had been a fire, and she was gone. "Mr. Rusk," Hayes said quietly, is there anything I can do?" Gideon folded the telegram. He pressed it once, neatly, along the crease. Then he folded it again and put it inside his shirt, against his chest, where he would not have to look at it but would know exactly where it was. "No," he said. His voice came out even. It surprised him. He picked up his hat from the counter, put it on, and walked out of the telegraph office into the April morning. He stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment. His horse was tied at the post 12 feet away. The general store was on the next block. He had a list of supplies in his coat pocket, written in his own handwriting, and somewhere on that list was a note to buy an extra tin of coffee, because Lenora had mentioned in her 3rd letter that she was particular about her coffee in the mornings. He looked at the street. He had been here before. Not at this exact spot, not on this exact morning. But here, this place where the world continued its ordinary motion and you were expected to continue yours, and the distance between those 2 facts was a thing you either crossed or fell into. Gideon crossed it. He bought the supplies. He was polite to the shopkeeper. He loaded the wagon without rushing and without lingering. He did not buy the extra coffee tin because there was no longer any reason to. When he drove out of Drywater Crossing on the road back to Cinder Ridge, the telegram was still against his chest, and the morning was still unreasonably bright, and the east hill ahead of him caught the light the way he had described it to Lenora in his 2nd letter, the way a place looks when you want to share it with someone and suddenly understand that you cannot. He drove home. He put the horse away. He walked into the house. He stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at the chair he had moved back to its place across the table. Then he turned it back to face the corner. And he went out to check on the cattle, because the cattle still needed checking, and a man still had to be somewhere, and Cinder Ridge was the only somewhere Gideon Rusk had left. He didn't tell anyone for 3 days. He wasn't ready for what telling would do. Once you told people, it became the thing that had happened to you, and other people's responses to it became part of the story, and Gideon needed it to stay just his for a little while. Private grief was one thing he still knew how to manage, but Drywater Crossing was a small place, and small places have their own information systems that require no telegraph wire. By Thursday, Walt Purvis had heard something from his wife, who had heard it from the postmaster's wife. By Friday, 2 women from the church had appeared at the edge of Cinder Ridge's drive with a covered dish, which Gideon accepted with quiet thanks and ate none of. "We're so sorry, Gideon," the older of the 2 women said. Her name was Mrs. Calloway, and she had a kind face and meant well. "It was an awful thing." "Yes," Gideon said. "You couldn't have known, of course. You couldn't have known how these arrangements turn out." He looked at her. She seemed to realize, a half-second too late, that what she'd just said was not precisely what she'd meant to say. Her friend touched her arm. There was a small, tight silence. "She was a person," Gideon said quietly. "Not an arrangement." He thanked them for the food and went back inside. Later that evening, he sat at the table and took the telegram out of his shirt. He smoothed it flat. It had been against his body for 4 days, and the paper had softened at the fold lines. The ink slightly blurred where sweat had reached it. Lenora Vance, passenger, deceased. He thought about her 3rd letter, the one where she'd written about the brick wall outside her window, how she'd described watching a single weed push up through a crack in the mortar across the alley, and how she'd found herself rooting for it in the mornings, which she said was probably a sign that she'd been in that room too long. It had made him laugh, alone at this same table, the kind of laugh that felt unfamiliar in his own throat. He thought about the sentence he'd been carrying since her first letter, something large enough to be worth failing at. She had been worth it. That was the unbearable part. Not just as a concept, not just the idea of a wife, of company, of a life with another person in it, but her specifically. Lenora Vance specifically, with her precise sentences and her unsentimental honesty and the small, perfect detail of a weed in a brick wall. He pressed the telegram flat one more time. Then he put it back inside his shirt. 6 days. He would give himself exactly 6 days, and then he would be the man he had trained himself to be. The one who handled what was handed to him and kept moving, and did not ask the world to be different than it was. He blew out the lamp. He sat in the dark for a while. Outside, the wind moved across Cinder Ridge the way it always had, indifferent to what any man at any table had lost. 6 days. That was the number Gideon had given himself. Not because 6 days was enough time to grieve, he understood grief well enough to know it didn't operate on schedules, but because 6 days was what remained between the telegram and the date Lenora was supposed to arrive. April 18th. He'd circled the date in his mind so many times over the past weeks that it had worn a groove there, and now the date remained even though the reason for it didn't, like a fence post left standing after the fence is gone. He woke on the first morning after receiving the telegram at 4:15, the same time he always woke, and lay in the dark for exactly 3 minutes before getting up. That was new. Before the letters, before any of this, he had been out of bed within 30 seconds of waking. Not from discipline or not entirely. More from the fact that lying still in the dark had nothing to offer him. Now it did, and what it offered was bad for him, so he limited himself to 3 minutes and then put his feet on the floor. The kitchen was cold. He built the fire the same way he always built it, the same sequence of actions, kindling first, then the larger pieces and the damper adjusted just so. The routine was a rope he was holding in the dark. He held it. He made coffee. He drank it standing at the window looking at the yard, which was nothing particular in the pre-dawn gray, just dirt and a fence line and the shape of the barn. Sargent, the one-eared barn cat, appeared at the window ledge from wherever he slept and pressed his face against the glass in the demanding way he had, and Gideon went to the door and let him in, which he did not normally do. But the kitchen felt large in a way kitchens aren't supposed to feel, and the cat was at least a body in it. Sargent wound around his boots twice, determined that no food was immediately forthcoming, and went and sat on the chair across the table. Gideon looked at the cat on the chair. The chair he had moved back to face the corner. "Get down," he said. The cat looked at him with the profound indifference of a creature that has survived significant hardship and found human preferences largely irrelevant. Gideon looked away first. He didn't move the cat. He picked up his coffee and went out to see to the cattle. And the morning began the way mornings do, whether you are ready for them or not. By the second day, Drywater Crossing knew. Not everything, not the specific details, not the name, not the full shape of what had been lost, but the outline. The telegraph operator, Hayes, was not a gossip by nature, but he was 20 years old and bad at carrying heavy things quietly, and he had mentioned it to the wrong person, who mentioned it to two more. That was all it took in a town of 400 people. By mid-morning the second day, Gideon could feel it when he rode in for a part he needed for the water pump. A slight shift in how people moved around him. The particular careful quality of eye contact that said, "We know something happened and we don't know what to say about it." He didn't help them. He bought the part and rode home. What happened next? He hadn't expected. Walt Purvis came by the third evening. Not with food, not with a covered dish or a sympathetic woman beside him. Just Walt, on horseback, pulling up to the yard and tying his horse, and walking over to where Gideon was splitting wood for no good reason, except that splitting wood required his whole body and left almost no room for thinking. Walt was 61 years old and had buried a son and a business partner in the same year some years back, and he was not the kind of man who talked about it, which made him and Gideon well suited as neighbors. He came and stood near the chopping block and watched Gideon split 3 pieces without saying anything. Then he said, "You need help with anything?" "No," Gideon said. "All right." Walt didn't leave. He stood there with his hands in his coat pockets while Gideon split 2 more pieces, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, which was the particular grace of a man who knew when not to speak. After a while, Walt said, "Hayes told my wife it was a fire on the train." That's what the telegram said. "You'd been writing to her a while." It wasn't a question. Gideon set a new piece on the block. 6 letters. Walt was quiet a moment. "That's enough to know something." "Yes," Gideon said. "It is." He split the piece. Walt watched the 2 halves fall. "You gonna be all right?" Walt asked. Not the soft, careful way Mrs. Calloway had asked it, wrapped in sympathy like something breakable. Just straight, the way one man asks another when he actually wants to know the answer. Gideon considered the question seriously, which was the respect it deserved. "I was all right before," he said finally. "I expect I'll work back toward it." Walt nodded. He stayed another 10 minutes, and they talked about the water level in the creek and whether the spring grass was coming up slow, or whether it just seemed that way after the long winter. And then he untied his horse and rode home, and Gideon went inside and ate something without tasting it and went to bed. He lay in the dark and thought about what Walt had said. "That's enough to know something. 6 letters." Yes. 6 letters had been enough to know that Lenora Vance was someone he would have argued with and laughed at and been occasionally baffled by and trusted in the specific, irreplaceable way you trust someone who shows you their actual thinking instead of the polished version. He knew that from 6 letters. He could not have said he knew it from more. He reached up in the dark and pressed one hand against his chest, where the telegram was still folded inside his shirt. He'd been wearing the same shirt for 3 days. He hadn't noticed until right now, and the fact that he hadn't noticed seemed like information about where he was. On the 4th day, something shifted. Not in the grief. The grief was patient, and he knew it would be there as long as it needed to be. But in the particular quality of his thinking about Lenora. He had been, in those first days, thinking about her death. The fire. The fact of her name on a manifest. Now he found himself, despite himself, thinking about her letters. Specific sentences. The weed in the brick wall. The line about her brother being pleasant but absorbed. The careful, absolute firmness of "I am not looking for rescue." He found himself wondering what she would have made of Walt Purvis, whether she would have liked him immediately or taken her time. He found himself wondering what she would have thought of Sargent, who was still, inexplicably, sleeping on the kitchen chair. He recognized what this was. It was the mind trying to keep a person alive past the point of their death, constructing them in the spaces where they no longer existed. He had done it with Eleanor too. It was not weakness. It was what minds do when they don't want to let go of something that mattered. He let himself think about her for a while. Then he went back to work. The 5th day was the hardest. He had been managing. He had been moving through the days with the careful mechanical competence of a man who understood that function was what kept you upright when feeling threatened to put you on the floor. But the fifth day had a quality to it he couldn't quite outwork, a gray heaviness that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the fact that tomorrow was April 17th, the day before she was supposed to arrive. And some part of him had been counting toward that date for weeks, and now had nowhere to put the counting. He found himself in the late afternoon standing at the door of the second bedroom, the one he'd quietly, without telling anyone, begun to make habitable. He hadn't done much. New curtains that he'd bought in Drywater Crossing on a supply run, telling himself it was practical, that the old ones were rotted at the hems. A chest of drawers he'd moved from the storage room. A better lamp. It was not much. It was more than it had been, and looking at it now, he felt something so close to embarrassment that he had to look away. He'd been preparing for her. Without saying so, without quite admitting it to himself, he had been making room. He pulled the door mostly closed and went and made himself something to eat, and did not go back to that room for the rest of the evening. That night he took the telegram out again. Not the way a man opens a wound, more the way you look at a bill you've already paid, checking once more that the number is right. The paper was very soft now, worn through from being folded and unfolded and pressed against his body, and taken out and smoothed and put away. Some of the ink had transferred to his shirt, Vance ghosted pale on the fabric over his breastbone. He sat at the table. Sargent was on the chair. The lamp made a small yellow circle on the wood. Lenora Vance, passenger, deceased, railcar fire. April 12th. Manifest confirmed. He had accepted it. That was the thing. He had done the work of acceptance, the grinding internal labor that nobody saw and nobody helped you with. He had moved the chair back to the corner. He had stopped buying the extra coffee tin. He had been deliberately, methodically returning himself to the shape of a man who expected nothing from the future because the future had proven again that it didn't hold. He folded the telegram. He put it back inside his shirt. He slept badly. The sixth day, April 17th, he decided to ride into Drywater Crossing. He needed salt and a new file for the farrier work, and there was no reason not to go except the particular way grief makes you want to stay inside, which was exactly why he forced himself to go. He'd learned that lesson the hard way after Eleanor. Staying inside and staying quiet was a relief for about 3 days and a trap for everything after. The morning was cool, but the sky had cleared after a week of low cloud and the light was different. That hard, clean western light that came with the first true spring days and made everything look slightly more than itself. Normally he liked it. Today it seemed beside the point. He tied his horse at the post outside the general store and went inside. The shopkeeper, a man named Dobb, was behind the counter arguing pleasantly with a farmer about the price of seed corn and nodded to Gideon when he came in. Gideon moved through the store the way he always did, efficient and unhurried, finding what he needed and adding it to the counter. Salt. The file. He stood there for a moment looking at the shelf where the coffee was stocked and made himself not pick up an extra tin and felt, irrationally, angry at himself for the impulse. He was at the counter paying when he heard it. The train whistle. The afternoon train. It came through Drywater Crossing 3 times a week, and Gideon knew its schedule the way he knew the weather patterns and the cattle cycle, as background information, relevant when relevant and otherwise unremarkable. He heard it now and felt nothing particular. He collected his change. He said goodbye to Dobb, who said something friendly in return that Gideon didn't quite catch. He walked out of the general store into the April afternoon. The train was slowing at the station, which was 2 blocks down the main road. Steam rising. The ordinary sounds of arrival, the grind of brakes, the hiss of pressure releasing, the voices of people on the platform. Gideon untied his horse. He was going to get on and ride home. He had his salt and his file, and there was no reason to be in town any longer. He stood there holding the reins. He didn't get on. He told himself later that he didn't know why he walked toward the station. He told himself it was nothing, just the momentum of a man with time to kill before the ride home. But that wasn't true, and somewhere underneath the lie he knew it. The truth was simpler and harder to say. Some part of him that had not accepted the telegram as cleanly as the rest of him had. Some stubborn, unreasonable corner of him that 6 letters had quietly colonized. That part walked him toward the station without his full permission. The platform was busy. A small crowd of people meeting passengers. A few men moving freight from the cargo car. A family with too much luggage negotiating their way through the confusion. The conductor stood at the near end of the car, calling out the stop in the bored, loud voice conductors use after years of repetition. Gideon stood at the edge of the platform, hands at his sides, watching passengers come down the steps the way you watch a thing you're not sure why you're watching. An older couple, a man in a business suit carrying 2 cases, a young woman with a child on her hip, a family of 4 who immediately began arguing about something in low, tired voices. He didn't know what he was doing here. He should go home. He was about to turn when he heard a sound from farther down the platform. Not words at first, just a voice. A woman's voice calling out across the noise of the station. Then the words resolved. "Mr. Rusk!" He turned. She was standing at the far end of the car, one hand on the railing at the top of the steps, the other arm held slightly away from her body at an angle that looked deliberate, careful. Travel-worn was the first thing he thought. Her jacket rumpled, her hat not quite straight, her face carrying the particular pale, drawn quality of someone who had not slept well in several days. Beside her on the platform, a battered trunk with one hinge darker than the other, recently repaired. Her right forearm was wrapped in a bandage. White cloth, a little gray at the edges now. The kind of bandage you don't put on a small thing. She was looking at him. He was looking at her. He had no picture of Lenora Vance. They hadn't exchanged photographs. Some couples did, and some didn't, and they had discussed it once in letters and agreed that the image a person builds from someone's words was probably more honest than any photograph anyway. So he had no way to verify, scientifically, that this was her. He knew anyway. Not from her face, which he was seeing for the first time. From the way she was standing, the particular quality of her stillness as she watched him process what he was seeing, the way she had called his name, not as a greeting, but as a question. "Mr. Rusk?" The voice of someone checking whether reality was doing what she thought it was doing. The telegram said she was dead. She was not dead. She was standing 20 feet from him on a train platform in Drywater Crossing with a battered trunk and a bandaged arm and hair coming loose from under a hat that had survived better days, and whatever Gideon Rusk had believed himself to be. A man who handled what was handed to him. A man who had organized himself out of needing anything. A man who had taken the grief of 6 days and compressed it into something he could carry. All of it came apart. Not loudly. There was nothing loud about it. He didn't shout. He didn't run. His knees simply went. One moment he was standing, the next he was on the platform boards, both knees down, one hand barely catching the edge of a freight crate beside him. He was not hurt. Nothing had happened to his body. His body had simply received information too large for it to hold upright. "Mr. Rusk," her voice changed, sharpened with alarm. She was coming toward him, moving faster than someone with a bandaged arm, and 2 days of exhaustion should move, threading between 2 other passengers who stepped back in surprise. "Are you... What happened? Are you ill?" She was crouching in front of him before he could answer. Close, real. She smelled like coal smoke and something faintly medicinal from the bandage. And underneath both of those things, something else entirely that was just her, just a person, a living person, with a warmth that came off her in the cool April air. He couldn't speak. He could look at her and he could understand what he was looking at, but the connection between understanding and speaking had temporarily gone somewhere without telling him. She put her uninjured hand on his arm. "Talk to me. Are you sick? Did something happen?" He reached into his shirt. He pulled out the telegram. The paper was soft and worn and slightly damp from days against his body, and the writing was blurred at the folds, but still legible. Still legible enough. He held it out to her. She took it. She read it. He watched her face while she read it. Watched the confusion first, a small crease between her brows. Then the moment her eyes caught her own name. Then the moment she understood what document she was holding. Her face did not collapse. She wasn't a woman whose face collapsed easily. He would come to know that about her. But it went very still. A specific, total stillness, like something suddenly and completely stopped. She looked up from the paper. Her eyes were brown. He hadn't known that. "You can't know that from letters." "This came to you," she said. Not a question. A person doing the arithmetic of a situation out loud. "April 12th, he said. His voice worked now, roughly, like something that had been sitting unused. 5 days ago. She looked back at the telegram. He could see her reading it again, slower, the same way he had. The way people reread things that don't make sense, hoping the sense will appear on the second pass. "Lenora Vale," she said, mostly to herself. "There was a woman. In the car ahead of mine. I heard her name once, or something like it. When they were, after the fire, when they were, she stopped. Her jaw tightened for a moment. The manifest was handwritten. Someone must have, my name and hers must have. Yes, Gideon said. She kept looking at the telegram for another few seconds. Around them, the station was continuing its business. Passengers moving, freight being shifted, the conductor calling out. Nobody had particularly noticed the man on his knees and the woman crouching in front of him, or if they had, they were being politely Western about it and keeping their eyes elsewhere. Lenora looked back at him. You have been carrying this for 5 days, she said. Yes. Against your chest. He didn't answer that. The evidence was in her hands. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he couldn't read or couldn't read yet. Then she reached out and placed the telegram in his hand, not releasing it until she was sure he had it. I'm sorry, she said. I sent a letter. The train was delayed 3 days in Indiana. A mechanical problem. They switched the cars and there was a wait, and I sent a letter from the station explaining everything. I didn't know any of this had. The letter didn't arrive, he said. The telegram did. I know that now. She sat back slightly on her heels, looking at him with the expression of someone assembling a picture from pieces that have arrived in the wrong order. How long were you? What did you think when you read, I thought you were dead? He said it plainly because there was no other way to say it. I spent 5 days making peace with it. Something moved across her face. He saw it and couldn't name it exactly. Something between grief and a kind of sharp, sorrowful understanding. And then you came to the station, she said. I came for salt, he said. And a file. She looked at him. For half a second, against everything, against the worn telegram and her bandaged arm and his knees on the platform boards, something flickered at the corner of her mouth. Salt and a file, she repeated. General store, he said. 2 blocks. And you just happened to... I don't know why I walked to the station, he said. I was going to get on my horse. She looked at him for a long moment. The thing at the corner of her mouth had not quite resolved into a smile. It was more careful than a smile. It was the expression of someone deciding whether a thing is safe to feel. Can you stand up? She asked. Yes, he said. He stood up. It took a moment. His knees were not as young as they had been, and the boards were hard. But he got there, and she straightened beside him, and they were standing facing each other in the middle of a train platform in a small western town on a cold April afternoon. A man who had buried a woman twice in his mind, and a woman who had been on a burning train and sent a letter that arrived too late. And the distance between them was about 2 feet, and the history between them was 6 letters and 5 days of grief and 1 very worn telegram. Gideon looked at the trunk beside her. It was a substantial trunk. One person probably couldn't lift it without effort. He looked back at her. You need a ride, he said. I do, she said. He picked up one end of the trunk. I have a wagon. She picked up the other end, which surprised him. He'd been about to manage it himself. And they carried it together toward where his wagon was tied, walking at a matched pace, not talking, through the ordinary April afternoon of Drywater Crossing, past the general store and the telegraph office, and the hardware, and the people going about the business of their day. Hayes, the telegraph operator, was standing in the doorway of his office when they passed. He stared. Gideon saw him stare and kept walking. They loaded the trunk onto the wagon. Gideon helped her up to the seat because the step was high and her arm was bandaged, and that was the practical fact of it. She settled herself, and he went around and got up on the other side and took the reins. They sat there for a moment without moving, the horse patient in the traces, the town going on around them. The East Hill, Lenora said. He looked at her. In your second letter, she said, you described the way the East Hill looks in the afternoon light. You said it was the thing you'd most want someone else to see. He looked at the road ahead. It'll be close to the right hour when we get there, he said. Good, she said. He clicked to the horse and they moved out of Drywater Crossing onto the road that led to Cinder Ridge. 2 strangers who had spent 6 weeks learning each other through paper and ink and were now, for the first time, sitting within arm's reach of each other in the real air of the real world. And neither of them spoke much on the way home, and neither of them needed to, and the afternoon light was doing exactly what Gideon had described in his second letter, which was more than either of them had expected from an April day that had already asked a great deal of both of them. The road to Cinder Ridge was not a short road. 18 miles on a good day, longer when the spring mud caught the wheels. Gideon knew every rut and slope of it, knew where to ease up and where to push through, and he drove it now with the same competence he brought to everything practical. While being very aware that approximately 14 inches to his right, Lenora Vance was sitting very still and looking at the country opening up around them. She hadn't been west before. She had said so in her letters, had said it plainly, without pretending to a familiarity she didn't have, which he had appreciated. A lot of the letters he'd read from the agency, passed around among the ranchers who'd corresponded with more than one woman, were full of women performing enthusiasm for the frontier as though they thought that was what was required. Lenora had not performed. She had said, "I don't know what it looks like. I've seen paintings, and they look improbable. I expect the actual version will be different, and I'd rather be surprised than arrive having already decided what I think." Now she was arriving, and being surprised, and he watched her watching the land without making it obvious he was watching her. The territory had a way of going large on people who weren't used to it. The sky was the first thing. That western sky that didn't stop anywhere you could see. The horizon a clean, unbroken line that made people from cities or towns feel either free or exposed, depending on who they were. Then the grass, the particular pale green of spring grass on the plains, and the distances between things, the way you could see a stand of cottonwoods 2 miles ahead, and they didn't seem to get closer for a long time. It was a landscape that did not make small talk. It presented itself and let you reckon with it. Lenora was reckoning with it. He could see that. She was very quiet in the way that wasn't absence. It was a full silence, the silence of someone taking something in. They were about 8 miles out of town when she spoke. "How long did it take you?" she said. He glanced at her. "What?" "To stop feeling it. After your wife, how long until you could be in the house without it being the only thing?" He looked at the road. It was a direct question. She asked direct questions. He knew that from the letters, but it landed differently in person, a voice asking rather than ink on paper. "I don't know that I did," he said. "Stop feeling it. I think I got better at feeling other things alongside it." "How long did that take?" 2 years before it wasn't the first thing every morning. 3 years before a good day could get to the end without turning. He paused. "Some days it still turns." She was quiet a moment. "The fire," she said then, not looking at him, looking at the road ahead. "I was in the car behind. The one ahead caught first, and there was smoke before there was flame, and people started. It was loud and confused, and I couldn't see the door for about a minute and a half." She stopped. "A minute and a half is a long time when you don't know which direction the door is." He didn't say anything. He let her tell it. "I found the door. I got out. I burned my arm on the frame getting down because someone behind me was pushing, and I lost my footing." She looked at the bandage. "The doctor at the next station said it wasn't serious. It doesn't feel serious. It feels like a burn." She said that last part with a small dryness that seemed like the edge of something harder. "But for that minute and a half, I thought I was going to die." "You didn't," he said. "No." She looked at him then, for the first time in a while. And you spent 5 days thinking I had." "Yes." "That seems worse," she said quietly. He considered that. "Different," he said. The horse pulled them on. The road was better here, harder ground, and the wheels moved smoothly for a stretch. Somewhere ahead, still out of sight, was the East Ridge and the turn that brought Cinder Ridge into view. "I'm not easy to live with," Lenora said abruptly. Not a confession, more like information she was making sure he had. "I have opinions about how things should be organized, and I'm particular about them, and I know it, and I don't entirely apologize for it. I'm used to doing things by myself, and I sometimes forget that I'm not." "All right," Gideon said. "That's your answer? All right?" "I wasn't looking for someone without opinions," he said. "I've had enough of my own company. I'd like someone who argues back occasionally." She looked at him steadily. "You say that now." "I expect I'll mean it after I've been tested on it," he said. "I don't expect to be perfect about it." She held his gaze for a moment. "Neither do I." The road curved around the base of the ridge. Cinder Ridge came into view. It was not a grand sight. He knew that. He had never claimed it was. It was a working ranch. The house solid but plain, The barn larger than the house and newer, the yard practical and cleared, and not much to look at with beauty in mind. The fence lines were straight because Gideon was meticulous about fence lines, and because crooked fence lines were an actual problem, not an aesthetic one. There were cattle visible on the far slope. There was a garden space beside the house that had been turned but not planted, the dark soil squared off against the dry spring grass. And beyond all of it, behind and above, the east hill caught the late afternoon light. He hadn't planned the timing. It simply was what it was. They had arrived when they arrived, and the sun was where it was, and the hill was doing what the hill always did in that hour, the light breaking across it at an angle that made the grass look almost warm, almost golden at the tips. The kind of light that suggested the day has been a difficult one, but is willing to end well if you let it. He heard Lenora make a sound. Not a word. Something shorter than a word. He looked at her. She was looking at the hill. Her face had opened in a way that was different from the careful, controlled expressions she'd been wearing since the platform. The expressions of a woman managing a very large day. This was unguarded. This was someone seeing a thing and being moved by it before she had time to decide whether to be. "You said it was," she started, "in the second letter. You didn't. I thought you were being. I thought it was just something people say." "I don't say things I don't mean," he said, "in letters or otherwise." She kept looking at the hill. The light was moving, the way it does in that hour, the angle shifting slightly with every minute, and the hill changed as they watched. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the gradual, honest way that real things change. "All right," she said softly. It was his word, the one he'd used earlier, and she was using it back at him now, and the tone was different than his had been, less matter-of-fact, more like something settling into place. He stopped the wagon near the house. He got down and went around and offered her his hand for the step down, and she took it, and for a second they were just two people with their hands clasped, which they had not been before today, and which was a different thing than letters and telegrams and train platforms, more ordinary and stranger, both at once. She let go when she was on the ground. She looked at the house. He watched her look at it. The plain front of it, the window with its new curtains that he had not told her about, the porch that needed a board replaced on the third step. "The step," he said. "Third one." "I know." She glanced at him. "Were you going to fix it?" "I was getting around to it. Before or after I arrived?" "I had 6 days," he said. "Now I have fewer." She looked at the house for another moment. "I'll take the right side of the bedroom," she said. "I sleep on the right." He hadn't shown her the bedroom. She had simply decided. He looked at her, at the practical, unromantic certainty of that statement, at the woman who had survived a train fire and a 5-day delay and a dead woman's name on a manifest, and a tearful reunion on a platform, and 18 miles of open country, and was now standing in a ranch yard in the late afternoon deciding which side of a bed she was going to sleep on. "All right," he said. "You keep saying that." "It keeps being true," he said. A corner of her mouth did the thing it had done on the platform. The thing that was almost a smile but more careful than a smile. The thing that seemed like the beginning of something that hadn't fully decided to arrive yet. She picked up the smaller bag she'd been carrying. She looked at the porch. "Third step," she said. "Third step," he confirmed. She went up the first step. The second. She stepped deliberately over the third and onto the porch and pushed the front door open and went inside. Gideon stood in the yard for a moment. The east hill was still catching the last of the good light. Sargent appeared from somewhere and sat on the bottom porch step and looked at Gideon with the expression of a creature that has witnessed many things and judged most of them adequately. Gideon picked up Lenora's trunk. He carried it inside. The kitchen was the first room, and she was already in it, standing at the window, looking out at the yard and the hill beyond. She had set her small bag on the table. The chair that had faced the corner was back in its place across from his, though he hadn't moved it. And then he realized he had moved it, on the 5th day, in the dark, without quite knowing he was doing it, and had not moved it back. She didn't ask about the chair. She stood at the window and watched the hill until the light finally went, which was not long. Then she turned and looked at the kitchen, the stove, the shelves, the lamp on the table, with the assessing, specific attention of someone who is figuring out how a space works, not admiring it. "The coffee," she said. "Where do you keep it?" "Top shelf," he said. Left. She found it. She looked at how much there was. She looked back at him. "You're going to need to buy more," she said. "I know," he said. He had not bought the extra tin because there had been no reason to. Now there was a reason, and she was standing in his kitchen holding the coffee tin with her bandaged arm held at its careful angle, and the lamp was lit and the door was closed, and outside the April night was coming down over Cinder Ridge the way it always did, indifferent and enormous, the same night that had pressed on this house for 7 empty years. It felt different tonight. Not easy, not resolved, not the ending of anything. It felt like a house with 2 people in it. That was enough for tonight. That was in its own way everything. The first morning was the strangest. Gideon woke at 4:15 the way he always woke, and for approximately 4 seconds he existed in the ordinary darkness of a man alone in his house. The familiar shapes of the ceiling above him and the familiar sounds of the ranch settling in the pre-dawn cold. Then the 4 seconds ended and he remembered, and the remembering was not unpleasant, but it was startling in a way he hadn't anticipated. The sudden knowledge that there was another person breathing somewhere in this building, a person who had not been here yesterday morning and who was here now and who was going to be here tomorrow morning too. He lay still for longer than his usual 30 seconds, listening. The house was quiet, the particular quiet of early morning, before the birds, before the wind picked up. He could hear nothing from the second bedroom, which was expected. Walls were walls. But he was aware of the closed door down the hall in a way he was not aware of closed doors when they opened onto empty rooms. He got up. He built the fire. Money made coffee, and he made enough for 2 cups without having to think about it. And then he stood in the kitchen, in the lamplight holding his cup, and wondering when she would be up, and whether he should wait or go to the barn and begin the morning work and let her wake on her own schedule, and realized he had no protocol for this because he had not had another person in this house for 7 years, and whatever instincts he'd once had for cohabitation had rusted to nothing. He went to the barn. It was easier out there. The cattle needed what they always needed, and the barn had its own smell and logic, and the morning work moved him through the first hour without requiring any decisions about other people. He was in the middle of checking the water trough when he heard the back door of the house open and close. He didn't go look. He kept working. About 20 minutes later, Lenora appeared at the barn door. She had found a coat, her own, from the trunk, and she was wearing it over what she'd slept in, which appeared to be a practical flannel situation that had nothing sentimental about it. Her hair was down, which was the first time he'd seen it that way, and it was longer than he'd expected and not yet brushed. She was holding 2 cups, and she looked like someone who had slept adequately, but not well, and was functional about it. "You didn't wake me," she said. "You didn't ask me to." "I'm used to being up early." "Then you were up early," he said, "without my help." She came into the barn and held out one of the cups. He took it. It was coffee, and it was stronger than he usually made it, and he didn't say anything about that. She looked around the barn with the same assessing attention she'd given the kitchen the night before, taking inventory, measuring, figuring out how the space worked. Her eyes moved from the stall arrangement to the feed storage to the tool wall to the hayloft, and she didn't comment on any of it, just looked. "The bandage," he said. "Does it need changing?" She glanced at her arm. "I can manage it." "I have clean cloth." "I said I can manage it, Gideon." It was the first time she had used his name without the Mr. in front of it, and neither of them remarked on it. And he went back to the water trough, and she stood in the middle of the barn and drank her coffee, and after a while she said, "What do you need done this morning?" He looked at her. "I didn't come here to sit in the kitchen," she said, with a patience that had an edge to it, the patience of someone explaining something they feel shouldn't require explanation. "I came here to build something. Tell me what needs doing," he told her. He gave her the things that were real work, but not the work that required 7 years of muscle memory, or the kind of physical strength that a burn injury had no business being tested against. She didn't argue with the assignments, which surprised him a little. He had expected her to push back on the lighter tasks. Instead, she just nodded and went and did them, and she did them competently, which surprised him more. The morning passed. It was not graceful. She didn't know where things were and had to ask, and asking seemed to cost her something small each time. He said too little when she asked questions, and too much when she didn't, which was his ordinary pattern with people, but felt more consequential now that the person was going to be here at dinner. Sargent investigated her with aggressive thoroughness, and she tolerated the cat's attention without enthusiasm but without cruelty, which Gideon noted without commenting on. At noon, they ate at the kitchen table facing each other for the first time at a meal, and it was not terrible, but it was not easy. They talked about practical things, the garden, the water situation, the nearest town, safe things, the kinds of things you talk about when you are two people who know each other well on paper and are discovering that paper is a very specific medium and the real version is more complicated in all directions. After lunch, she went to the second bedroom and shut the door, and he heard her moving around in there for an hour, unpacking and arranging, and he went back to the afternoon work and didn't bother her, and by the time supper came, they were marginally more comfortable, which was, he told himself, appropriate to the second half of the first day. What he hadn't told her, what he hadn't told anyone, not Walt, not anyone in Drywater Crossing, was the specific quality of the fear that had set up residence in him since she'd stepped off that train. It was not the same fear he'd felt after Eleanor. After Eleanor, the fear had been retrospective. The terror of what had already happened, the way loss can echo forward and make every good thing feel temporary. That fear he knew. He'd learned to carry it. This was something different and in some ways worse, because Lenora was here. She was alive and real and in his house, and that was the source of the fear rather than the relief of it. Every time she stepped out of his line of sight, something in him went taut. Not immediately, not in the first second. But if 2 minutes passed and he didn't know where she was, a cold thing moved through his chest. If she was longer at the garden than he expected, he found himself at the window. If he heard an unusual sound from the barn while she was in the barn, he was halfway to the door before he'd made a conscious decision to move. He recognized what it was. He wasn't stupid about it. He had spent 5 days believing she was dead, and his mind had not fully caught up with the correction. Some part of him was still operating on the information of the telegram, still braced for a loss that had already been canceled, still standing at that telegraph counter in Drywater Crossing, reading words that were no longer true. He didn't tell her any of this. He told himself it would pass, that the mind needed time to recalibrate the same way a compass needs time to find north after you've been too close to iron. Reasonable. Normal. He would simply wait it out and be careful not to let it show. The second week was better than the first in practical terms. Lenora learned where things were and stopped having to ask for most of them. She established her own rhythms in the house. Coffee first, strong, before any conversation. Garden work in the morning while the light was good. Afternoons for the sewing she'd brought with her, the particular precise handwork she'd done for 16 years in a Philadelphia shop, and which she did now sitting at the kitchen table in the afternoon quiet, with a concentration that seemed to give her something the rest of the day didn't. She was good with her hands in ways that went beyond the sewing. He noticed it gradually, the way she assessed problems. The canvas feed covers he kept in the barn were rotting at the seams, and he'd been replacing them piece by piece for 2 years. And she looked at them one morning with the eyes of someone who understood fabric at a structural level and said, "You're patching the symptom, not the problem. The seams are wrong. You need a different stitch on anything that's going to take tension and weather." She said it matter-of-factly, not critically. And he said, "All right, show me." And she did. And the next set of covers they made together on the kitchen table lasted 3 seasons longer than anything he'd produced alone. But the town was the harder thing. Drywater Crossing had watched the whole sequence of events with the particular attention small towns give to anything unusual, which was total and merciless and not entirely unkind, but not entirely kind either. They had seen Gideon receive a death telegram. They had seen him grieve in his closed-off, competent, slightly alarming way. They had then seen him drive back through town the following day with a living woman beside him on the wagon, and the cognitive adjustment required had not been smooth for everyone. Some people were simply relieved and said so warmly. Walt Purvis came by the second week with his wife, a broad-shouldered woman named Clara, who shook Lenora's hand firmly and looked her in the eye and said, "Good." He needed someone with sense, which was probably the most generous thing Clara Purvis had ever said to a stranger, and which seemed to satisfy some requirement Lenora had of people she was willing to trust. But others were slower about it. Some of the women in town who had initially viewed the matrimonial agency arrangement with polite skepticism. Now added to that skepticism, a particular edge that Gideon heard only at a distance. The suggestion that a woman who showed up alive after a death telegram was perhaps not entirely what she claimed to be, that perhaps the telegram had been correct, and Lenora Vance was not her actual name, that there was something irregular about the whole business that warranted watching. He heard this from Hayes, who told him with the guilty urgency of someone delivering information they felt obliged to share, even though they wished they didn't have to. Hayes was a decent young man, and he felt responsible for the telegram situation in a way that wasn't entirely warranted but wasn't entirely wrong either. "I just thought you should know," Hayes said, standing outside the telegraph office while Gideon was loading supplies into the wagon. "I don't believe any of it. I'm just saying some people are talking." "People talk," Gideon said. "Some of it isn't very kind." "I know what unkind talk sounds like," Gideon said. "Lenora does too, I'd imagine. She lived in a city for 32 years. It's just, if you wanted to say something to people, set the record straight. I don't answer to Drywater Crossing for my personal arrangements," Gideon said, not harshly, just factually. Neither does she. He told Lenora about it that evening. He told her because she deserved to know, and because hiding useful information from her seemed like the wrong foot to start on. He told her plainly, without softening it excessively or dramatizing it, the way he told her most things. She listened. She was mending something at the kitchen table, and she kept her eyes on the work while he talked. And when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do they think I am? A ghost? A fraud?" "A fraud is the main theory, near as I can tell." "Based on what evidence?" "Based on the fact that the telegram said one thing and reality said another, and some people find that easier to explain with human dishonesty than with railroad record-keeping errors." She looked up from the mending. Her expression was not wounded. It was thoughtful, which was the particular quality he had come to expect from her when something was difficult. She didn't rush to feel things. She processed them first and felt them second, which he respected even when it made her hard to read. "Mrs. Aldrin at the dry goods," she said. "She was very deliberate about not looking at me this morning." "Yes." "And the woman at the post office, Hargrove's wife, she asked me twice where I was from, the second time more slowly than the first, as though I might have forgotten my own answer." "Yes." "All right," she said. She went back to the mending. "I'll have to show them." "Show them what?" "That I'm what I said I am." She said it without frustration, almost without emotion, the way you say I'll have to fix the fence rather than I hate that the fence broke. "Not by explaining myself. Explaining yourself to people who've decided what you are is a waste of everyone's time. I'll just be here. Work. Show up. It'll either change their minds or it won't." He looked at her. "That could take a long time," he said. "I know that," she said. "I have a long time." He had no good answer for that, so he didn't make one. What happened in the third and fourth weeks was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the slow, unremarkable business of two people constructing a shared life out of the raw material of their separate habits, which involves a great deal of small friction and occasional silence, and the gradual, not always comfortable discovery of where each person's edges are. He learned that she was genuinely particular about organization in a way that was not neurotic but was non-negotiable. If she put something somewhere, it was in that place for a reason, and moving it without telling her created a specific kind of tension that expressed itself not in anger but in a very calm and slightly pointed question about where the thing had gone. He told her once, mildly, that the ranch had its own organization system that had been working for 7 years, and she said, equally mildly, that several aspects of it were inefficient, and she had already improved 3 of them, and was he interested in discussing the others? He was not particularly, but he said yes, and they discussed them, and 2 of her 3 improvements were genuinely better, which he acknowledged, and one was a matter of preference rather than efficiency, and she conceded that point without making a production of it, and this seemed to establish something between them about how disagreements would work. He learned that she was not easy with praise. She received compliments. When he said her improved seam technique on the canvas covers was the right call, when Walt's wife Clara told her the preserves she'd helped put up were the best she'd tasted, with a brief nod that closed the subject rather than an expression of pleasure. It wasn't false modesty. It was more like she kept her inner assessments of things privately and was not convinced by outside opinions until she had arrived at the same conclusion herself through her own accounting. He understood that. He was the same way, roughly. He simply expressed it differently. He learned that she missed Philadelphia in ways she didn't talk about, but that showed up at odd moments. She would mention something, a specific street, a particular bakery, the sound of a certain kind of morning crowd. and then stop herself mid-sentence as though she'd said more than she intended. He didn't push into those moments. He let them pass and filed them away. She had left a life for this one, and the leaving was real, and acknowledging it wasn't the same as regretting it, and he trusted her to know the difference between those two things. What he did not learn to control was the fear. He had thought it would diminish with time. That was logical. Logical things often worked out, in his experience. But this one didn't, or didn't on the schedule he'd assigned it. The cold tightening in his chest when she was out of his sight too long, it persisted. He learned to manage the expression of it, to keep it contained to a window check or a brief detour past the garden when she was supposed to be in the garden. She didn't notice, or if she noticed, she didn't say anything. But it was there. Every day, underneath everything else, the memory of those 5 days was there, and the terrible logic of it. He had lost her once. It had not been real, but it had been real enough to break him open in the middle of a train station, which meant the actual loss, the real one, the one that would be real, was something he could not even let himself think about directly. So instead he made sure she didn't go to the east pasture alone. He made sure the barn latch was fixed. He made sure the horse she'd started learning to ride was the most predictable animal in his string. He told himself these were practical decisions, and they were, mostly, practical decisions. But there was something else threaded through them too, and he knew it, and he kept knowing it, and he didn't say anything about it. The thing that broke the arrangement open was not a large event. It was a Tuesday in the middle of May, clear and warm, the first genuinely warm day they'd had. Lenora had said at breakfast that she was going to ride out to the creek crossing to see whether the wild irises were up yet, because she'd heard Clara Purvis mention them and wanted to see for herself. She said it the way she said most things, as information, not a request for permission, because she did not operate on the permission system and never had. He said fine. He watched her saddle the horse. She'd gotten competent at it quickly, another thing about her that shouldn't have surprised him, and still did, and ride out toward the creek. He went back to work. 20 minutes passed. 30. He was in the barn repairing a broken hinge, and he knew the creek was 20 minutes each way on a slow ride, and that she'd want time to actually look at the irises if she found them, and that 45 minutes to an hour was completely reasonable, and there was nothing wrong. He set down the hinge. He went to the barn door and looked at the trail toward the creek. Empty trail. Blue sky. Nothing. He went back to the hinge. He lasted 4 more minutes. He told himself he was going to check the south fence line, which happened to take him past the general direction of the creek. This was not dishonest exactly. The south fence line did need checking. He just hadn't planned to check it today. He took the horse out and rode south. He saw her before she saw him. She was at the creek crossing, off her horse, crouching at the bank, looking at something in the water. Whether she'd found the irises or something else, he couldn't tell at the distance. The horse was tied to a branch nearby, and her hat was hanging off the saddle horn, and her hair was doing what her hair did when she'd been outside for more than 20 minutes, which was escape from whatever she'd tried to contain it with that morning and go its own direction. She was fine. She was completely, obviously fine. He stopped his horse on the rise above the creek and just stood there for a moment. He felt the relief, which was disproportionate to the situation and which told him clearly that this was not actually about fence lines. She looked up then, some instinct, or the sound of the horse, and saw him on the ridge. She stood. She shielded her eyes against the sun. "South fence?" she called up. "Yes," he said. A pause. "Is it south?" she called. He looked at the fence line to his left, which was indeed the south fence. "Yes." "Did you need to come this way to check it?" The wind moved through the grass between them. A red-winged blackbird made its noise somewhere near the water. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment from down by the creek. Even at that distance, he could tell her expression had shifted from the question to something that was thinking past the question. "Come down," she said. "There's something in this water I can't identify." He rode down. It turned out to be a small turtle, and probably far from any body of water large enough to have produced it, sitting on a rock at the water's edge, with the expression of a creature that has made a significant journey and is reconsidering its decisions. They looked at it for a while. It did not seem impressed by their attention. "Where do you think it came from?" she said. "Don't know. Creek dries out in August. Don't usually see them here." "It's very small to have come so far." "Things manage," he said. She looked at the turtle. Then she looked at him. The angle of the afternoon light was direct and he couldn't hide much in it, which he suspected she knew. "The fence wasn't why you came," she said. He looked at the turtle. "No," he said. She didn't say anything immediately. She crouched down to look at the turtle more closely, turning a small stone over in her uninjured hand, the bandage mostly healed now, but the scar still visible at the edge of it. "You were checking on me," she said. "Yes." This isn't the first time. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer it like one. "No," he said. She turned the stone over, put it down. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was working something through. Not the comfortable quiet of a person at ease, but the working quiet of a person making decisions. "How often?" she said. "Often enough that I know I'm doing it." She looked up at him. He was still on the horse, which gave him some height over where she was crouching, and she tilted her head back slightly to look at him, and her expression was serious in the particular way her face went serious, without theatrics, without warmth either, just a direct and careful thing. "I'm not Eleanor," she said. The name landed differently than he expected. Not painfully. More like a flat stone dropped from a height. A sound that was just itself, with its own weight. "I know that," he said. "I don't think you've confused us," she said carefully. "I think you're afraid I'll disappear the way she did, or the way I almost did, on the train, or the way the telegram said I did." She paused. "I think every time I go somewhere you can't see me, you're back in that telegraph office." He looked at her. The turtle had moved off its rock into the water and was making slow, definite progress toward the far bank. "I know it's not rational," he said. "I didn't say it was irrational," she said. "I said it was what's happening." She stood up, brushing her hands on her skirt. "Those are different things." He got down from the horse because having this conversation from horseback felt wrong, a kind of cowardice of posture, and he came and stood near her at the creek's edge, and they both looked at the water for a moment. "I spent 7 years," he said, "getting to a place where nothing being at stake felt like peace." "I know." "I thought I'd gotten past it. The wall. I thought the letters had, that when you arrived, I was past it." "You were past one version of it," she said. "The wall where you kept other people out. But there's another version underneath it, the one where you keep your fear in." He looked at her. "You see clearly," he said, and he didn't mean it entirely as a compliment, and she knew that, and she accepted it with a small movement of her head that acknowledged both the praise and the frustration wrapped inside it. "I'm not going to disappear, Gideon," she said. Not tenderly, not with the softness of a promise, just straight, the way she said most things. "I'm not planning to disappear. I know that doesn't help you very much because Eleanor wasn't planning to either, and because I was on a burning train 3 weeks ago, and that is a true thing that happened. But I'm telling you anyway because it's what's true right now, today, and I think you need to hear it even if it doesn't fix anything." He was quiet. The creek ran over the stones with the same indifference the territory brought to everything that happened on or near it. Kindly. "I mean it practically. I need to be able to ride to the creek and check on the irises, which are not up yet, for what it's worth," Clara Purvis was optimistic, "without you engineering a reason to come past. It's not good for you, and it's not—" She stopped. Started again. "I left a life that was too small for me. I don't want to build a smaller one out here than the one I left." "That's fair," he said. "I know it's fair. I'm asking whether you can do it." He thought about the question seriously, which it deserved. "I don't know," he said. "I think I can work toward it. I think it won't be immediate." She looked at him. Something in her face shifted slightly. Not softened exactly, but adjusted. The way a person's expression changes when they receive an honest answer to a question they half expected to be dodged. "That's a better answer than I thought I'd get," she said. "I try not to promise things I'm not sure of." "I know." She picked up her hat from the saddle horn and put it back on, adjusting the brim with the precise, practiced motion of someone who wore hats for function rather than decoration. "The south fence. What about it? Does it actually need checking?" He looked at it. "Third post from the big elm is loose," he said. "I'll hold the horse," she said. He looked at her. "I'm here," she said, the same flat, direct quality she'd had in every conversation of this kind. "I'm not going anywhere, so you can fix the fence." He went to fix the fence. She held the horse. The post was indeed loose. He had not fabricated that part. and it took him 20 minutes to properly reset it in the spring ground. And she stood nearby the whole time, not hovering, not watching him work with any particular attention, just present. At one point, Sargent, who had apparently followed them from the ranch on some obscure feline agenda, appeared out of the grass and sat near Lenora's feet with the air of a cat who had made this journey deliberately and found it adequate. "Your cat follows you," she said. "He follows whoever he's decided to follow," Gideon said from beside the fence post. "For years, that was nobody." "And now?" "You, mostly." She looked down at Sargent. "I haven't given him any particular reason." "He doesn't require reasons," Gideon said. "He makes up his mind, and that's that." She looked at the cat for a moment. "Sensible," she said. They rode back to Cinder Ridge together as the afternoon was cooling, not racing, not talking much. The horses walking at a pace that let the country move past them slowly. The east hill was behind them, and the house was ahead, and the spring light was doing the long horizontal thing it does at that hour, making shadows out of small things and turning the ordinary grass to something that looked worth looking at. At the yard gate, she stopped her horse. He stopped beside her. She looked at the house for a moment. Her house now too, or becoming so, in the incremental, unglamorous way that things become true by being repeated. "Gideon," she said. "Yes." "Next time you need to know where I am," she said, "ask." He looked at her. "That's all," she said. "Just ask. I'll tell you. We don't have to make it into something complicated." He considered that. It was such a simple solution that he hadn't thought of it, which said something about him that he did not find flattering. "All right," he said, "and I'll try to tell you when I'm going farther than usual, not because you need my permission to worry, but because—" She paused, seeming to weigh the next words. "Because you've already buried enough things. I don't want you burying anything about me that's still alive." He looked at her for a long moment in the late afternoon light of the yard he'd spent 7 years alone in. "That's a fair arrangement," he said. "Most of mine are," she said, and turned her horse toward the barn. He sat at the yard gate for another moment before following her. The east hill was in the full afternoon light behind him. The house ahead. Lenora was already at the barn door, dismounting with the careful competence of someone who'd been learning and was far enough along to forget she was still learning, which was its own kind of progress. He rode in after her. The barn had 2 horses in it now instead of 1, 2 sets of tack on the wall. Her saddle beside his, smaller and darker and still smelling faintly of the shop in Philadelphia where she'd bought it, though that smell was fading, had been fading since she arrived, replacing itself gradually with the smell of this barn and this territory and this specific life being built out of 2 separate people's materials, slowly, imperfectly, day by day. He untacked his horse. She untacked hers. They worked side by side in the quiet way they'd developed, which was not the comfortable quiet of people who'd been together for years, but something earlier and rougher than that. The quiet of people who are still figuring out how to be in the same space, but have decided jointly, without saying so, to keep trying. When they were done, they walked to the house. He held the porch door for her and she went through, stepping automatically over the 3rd step, which he still hadn't fixed, which she hadn't mentioned again after the first night. He went in after her. The kitchen was cool and the lamp needed lighting and there was supper to make, which they had fallen into making together without discussing it. Lenora taking the things she was better at, and Gideon taking the things he was better at, and the in-between things being negotiated on the fly with a minimum of ceremony. He lit the lamp. She moved to the shelves. The coffee tin was where she'd put it, which was not where he used to keep it, and he reached for it in the new location without having to look, which was a small thing, and which meant something, though he couldn't have said exactly what. She was talking about the irises again, whether they'd be up by next week, what Clara Purvis had said about the color. And he was listening and answering and making supper, and outside the May evening was coming down over Cinder Ridge with its enormous indifferent sky and its 1,000 acres of grass, and somewhere out there a small turtle making its determined way across a creek toward a destination it had decided on for reasons no one would ever know. The lamp made its small circle on the kitchen table. The 2 chairs faced each other. Neither of them was turned toward the wall. The irises came up the following week, just as Clara Purvis had predicted, and Lenora went to see them without saying anything to Gideon until she was saddling the horse, at which point she called across the yard, "Creek crossing, irises, hour, maybe less," and he called back from the fence line, "All right," and that was the whole of it. He did not follow her. He fixed the third porch step instead, which he had been putting off since the night she arrived. And when she came back, she stepped on it without thinking, and it held. And she paused for half a second on the porch and then went inside without saying anything about it. And that evening when they were eating, he noticed she had put a small bunch of the creek irises in an old glass jar on the kitchen windowsill, which he had not expected and which changed the look of the kitchen in a way he couldn't explain precisely but could feel. He didn't say anything about the flowers. She didn't say anything about the step. This was becoming their way. June arrived with its heat and its length of days, and the ranch work expanded into the extra light the way it always did, and Lenora expanded with it. She had a capacity for physical work that continued to surprise people who had decided based on her origins, Philadelphia, seamstress, educated, that she would be decorative about frontier life, would manage the inside work and leave the land to others. She did not do this. She was not reckless about it either. She assessed what she could do effectively, and she did those things with complete commitment, and she watched what she couldn't yet do until she could, and she did not pretend competence she hadn't earned. By June, she was managing the kitchen garden with an efficiency that had Gideon standing at the garden fence one morning, looking at the organization of it, the precise spacing, the deliberate arrangement of what was planted where and why, and thinking that it looked like the work of someone who had been doing it for years rather than weeks. She had reorganized the seed storage in the barn as well, using a system of cloth bags and labels that made more sense than the jumbled tin situation Gideon had been maintaining without acknowledgement of its inadequacy. And the first time she referred to it, and Gideon went directly to the right bag without having to search, he said nothing. But she saw it, and the corner of her mouth did the thing. The scar on her arm had healed to a pale ridge along her forearm. She no longer favored it, no longer held it at that careful angle she'd had when she stepped off the train. Sometimes he saw it when her sleeves were rolled up for garden work or cooking, and she never tried to hide it, just wore it the way you wear something that happened to you and is now part of the inventory of yourself. He had not asked her again about the fire. She had told him the essentials at the creek on the first day, and he understood that more details were available if she wanted to give them, and that wanting was hers to decide. What happened in town was slower and less clean than any of them would have liked. The women who had been skeptical, Mrs. Aldrin at the dry goods, a cluster of church women whose opinions moved in a coordinated way that suggested either remarkable coincidence or regular consultation, did not simply change their minds because time passed and Lenora continued to exist. That was not how that particular machinery worked. What shifted it, and shifted it slowly, was Lenora being useful to people in ways they couldn't argue with. It started with the Farrow family. The Farrows had a homestead about 4 miles north of Drywater Crossing, a husband and wife and 3 children under 10, and in the middle of June the wife, Nora Farrow, got a message to Lenora through Clara Purvis that she had a problem with a quilt she was trying to finish before the cold weather. A structural problem, the batting coming loose in a way that was going to undermine the whole piece if not fixed correctly. She asked, with the particular careful embarrassment of someone asking a favor from someone they're not entirely sure of yet, whether Lenora might look at it. Lenora went on a Tuesday. She was there for 3 hours. She fixed the quilt, which had a more complicated problem than the batting. The entire binding technique was wrong for the weight of the material. And while she was there, she also showed Nora Farrow 2 other techniques that would make her next project structurally sound from the start. She ate lunch with the family, and she did not perform the whole encounter. She was simply there, working, teaching, talking, real. Nora Farrow came into Drywater Crossing that Friday and said several specific things to several specific people, and the information spread in the same organic, unstoppable way that all Drywater Crossing information spread. And when Lenora came to town the following Tuesday for a supply run, Mrs. Aldrin at the dry goods looked at her directly for the first time and said, "I hear you helped the Farrow girl with her quilt." And Lenora said, "I did." And Mrs. Aldrin said, "That was a kind thing." And the conversation moved on to what Lenora needed from the store. And that was not forgiveness exactly, or even acknowledgement of anything, but it was a door opening that had been closed. More people came. Not in a flood. This was the territory and people had their pride and their distances to maintain, but steadily. A family whose winter stores were not laid by correctly. A woman who needed a complicated alteration to a coat that had to last another season. A man who needed a second opinion on a canvas shelter design before he committed the material. Lenora helped them all. She wasn't charitable about it in the soft, performing way. She didn't make a show of her generosity. She was just competent and available, and she told people the truth about their problems, which was not always what they wanted to hear, and which was, most of the time, exactly what they needed. Gideon watched this from the particular vantage point of someone who had lived in this community for years and understood its rhythms, and what he understood was that Lenora was not trying to win Drywater Crossing over. She was simply living her life in the direction of being useful, and winning people over was what happened when useful met repeated. The distinction mattered. People could tell the difference between being worked on and being served, and Lenora never worked on anyone. But the thing that was happening between them at Cinder Ridge, the two of them inside the daily life of the ranch, was its own separate territory, and it was not straightforward. The arrangement they'd made at the creek had worked, practically. Lenora told him where she was going. He asked when he needed to know. The constant low-level surveillance he'd been doing in the first weeks had eased, and the easing was real, not performed. His mind had begun, slowly, to recalibrate, to process the information that she was here and alive and capable and making reasonable decisions about her own safety. It was the way he'd said it would be at the creek. Not immediate. Working toward it. But there was a layer beneath the surveillance that the new arrangement hadn't touched. Something he hadn't told her about yet, because telling required admitting, and admitting required a kind of opening that he still only had so much capacity for. He could open himself at the practical level. He was learning, slowly, to open himself at the daily level, to share meals and work and the ordinary texture of life at close quarters. But the deeper level, the one where the actual fear lived, the one that ran on the information of 2 deaths and 1 near death and 5 days of a wrong telegram, that level he was still managing privately, at night, when the ranch was quiet and the dark was complete and his mind went where minds go when there's nothing else to occupy them. He woke most nights at least once, not from nightmares, not from anything dramatic, just from the particular alertness of a man who had trained himself, after Eleanor, to sleep lightly. He would wake, and the house would be quiet, and after a moment his mind would confirm that the quiet was normal, and he would lie still for a while, and sometimes go back to sleep, and sometimes not. On one of these nights in late June, he woke at 2 in the morning and lay in the dark and heard rain on the roof, which was unusual. Summer rain, a rarity in this dry country, the kind of thing that smelled of necessity rather than abundance. He lay still for a few minutes, and then he heard something else, a sound from the kitchen. Small. The particular creak of the 3rd floorboard from the hallway door, which he knew the way he knew every voice his house had. He was out of bed before he'd decided to get up. Old instinct. Not the good kind. The kind that had nothing to do with Lenora and everything to do with a man who had spent too many years alone in a house and had heard too many sounds in the dark that turned out to be nothing, and had never entirely trusted that they would be nothing. He came into the kitchen. Lenora was at the stove. She was in her nightclothes with a shawl around her shoulders, and she was heating milk, which he had not known she did, and she was looking out the kitchen window at the rain, which couldn't be seen in the dark except as a sound and a smell, and she turned when he came in, unsurprised, as though she'd heard him coming. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I heard you get up," he said. She looked at him for a moment. There was something slightly careful in her look. "Were you already awake?" "Yes," he said. "How often?" she said. Not accusing, just asking. He sat down at the kitchen table. He didn't answer immediately, which was an answer of its own kind. She poured the milk into a cup and brought it to the table and sat down across from him and pushed it toward him, and he took it because it was offered and because his hands needed something to hold, which he recognized as true in the moment and did not like recognizing. "How often do you wake up at night?" she said again, patient and direct. "Most nights," he said. "And stay up?" "Sometimes." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was turned low. She'd lit it when she came in, he assumed, because the glass was warm, and in the low light her face had a different quality than it did in the day. Less guarded. Not because she was less herself, but because the middle of the night has a way of stripping certain things down to what they actually are. "How long has this been happening?" she said. He thought about it honestly. "Before you came." "Years?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Did you sleep badly before Eleanor died?" he said. "No," he said. "After." How long after? It got better around the 3rd year. Then it was all right for a while. He turned the cup in his hands. The milk was warm, and he was not particularly interested in milk, but the warmth of the cup was grounding in a way that the dark kitchen at 2 in the morning required. Then the telegram. She heard the word land between them. And then I arrived, she said. Yes. And it came back. Yes. She looked at the table for a moment, then she looked back up at him. I want you to tell me something, she said, and I want you to tell me the real version, not the version you think is reasonable to say. He looked at her. All right, he said. When you woke tonight, she said, what were you afraid of? He was quiet. The rain moved on the roof. Sergeant appeared from wherever he'd been sleeping, investigated the situation briefly, and settled near the stove with the air of a cat who has decided to attend a meeting he didn't call and will leave when he's ready. That something had happened to you, Gideon said. In the night. In the house. Yes. What specifically? He looked at her. She was asking because she needed to know the actual shape of it, not because she wanted to make him feel it more acutely. He understood the difference. He had spent enough time around people who asked difficult questions to know the ones who asked to dig in versus the ones who asked to understand. That you'd gotten up and gone outside for some reason, he said. In the rain, in the dark. That something had happened out there. And then? And then I'd wake up in the morning and it would be the telegram again, except real this time. Silence. The rain. Lenora put both her hands around her own cup and looked at them for a moment. Then she said, when I was on the train, in the fire, there was a woman a few seats ahead of me. Older woman, traveling alone. She had a cloth bag on her lap the whole trip, the kind with a wooden handle. She'd been holding it since we boarded. When the smoke started and people began moving toward the doors, she didn't move. She just sat there with the bag on her lap. Lenora paused. I stopped. People were pushing past me both sides, and I stopped and I said, you need to get up. She looked at me and she said, I can't. Not that she didn't want to, that she couldn't, like her body had simply decided not. He was very still. I pulled her up, Lenora said. I had her arm with my good arm and someone helped from the other side and we got her out. She was the reason I was near the door frame when I burned my arm. If I'd gone straight out, I would have cleared it. You didn't tell me that part, he said. No, she said. I didn't. She turned the cup slowly in her hands. I told you about the fire and the burn and the wrong name on the manifest. I left out the woman because, she stopped, because the part that stayed with me afterward wasn't the fire. It was the look on her face when she said she couldn't, that complete failure of the body to move when the mind knows it needs to. I understood it. I understood it in a way I don't know how to explain because I have never been the kind of person whose body stops working in a crisis. I manage in crises. I always have. She looked up at him. But I understood it. Why are you telling me this now? He said. Because, she said, I think you know what that woman's face felt like. He looked at her. You've been managing, she said, since Eleanor. And when I came, you kept managing. And the managing is real. I see it. It's not fake. You are genuinely one of the most functionally capable people I have ever encountered in my life. She said this without warmth, just as fact, which made it feel more accurate than praise would have. But there's a difference between managing and moving, and I think, she stopped herself, started again more carefully. I think the telegram showed you the difference. I think for those 5 days you couldn't move, and now I'm here and you're managing again. And the managing is keeping you from telling me what the not moving felt like. The rain had softened. Somewhere far out the cattle would be at the low shelter, doing what cattle do in the rain, which was mostly stand there and endure it. The ranch was wet and dark and quiet, and he was sitting at his kitchen table at 2 in the morning across from the woman who had come to be here and was looking at him with the particular patience of someone who is prepared to wait for the truth. He had never told anyone what those 5 days were actually like. Not Walt, not Hayes, not anyone. He had told Lenora on the train platform that he had spent 5 days making peace with her death. And that was true, but it was the summary, the short public version of it. The real version lived somewhere below that, and he had not gone down to get it for anyone. He went down for it now. He told her about the first day. The ride home from Drywater Crossing with the telegram in his shirt, and the world carrying on around him as though nothing had changed. The specific quality of the silence at Cinder Ridge when he walked into it, knowing she would not be arriving on the 18th. How he had made supper and eaten it and the food had no taste, not because he was too sad for taste, but because he hadn't been paying attention to it, had just put food in his mouth because that was what the body required regardless of circumstance. He told her about the second day and the third, the mechanical competence of grief, the way he had done every necessary task with a precision that was about having no other resource for himself. He told her about moving the chair back to face the corner and not moving it back until the fifth night, alone, in the dark, for a reason he hadn't understood until just now, talking about it. He told her about the fifth day. Standing at the door of the second bedroom he had prepared without admitting he was preparing it, looking at the curtains he had bought because the old ones were rotted, and the feeling, not quite grief, not quite shame, of having made room for something that was now gone before it arrived. He told her about taking the telegram out on the sixth night and reading it in lamplight that had blurred the ink until the words were barely legible and still completely legible, indelible, and pressing it flat for what he had decided would be the last time before he put it away somewhere and stopped taking it out. And then he told her about riding into Drywater Crossing the next morning for salt and a file and hearing a train and not getting on his horse. She listened to all of it without interrupting. She did not reach across the table, did not make any of the sounds people make when they're listening empathetically, did not do any of the things that would have made him feel managed. She just listened, her hands around her cup, her eyes on him, letting him tell it at the pace it needed to be told. When he stopped, the kitchen was very quiet. "The chair," she said. "When you moved it back to facing the table, on the fifth night." "Yes." "That was before the sixth day, before you went into town." "Yes." "So some part of you bits." "I don't know what part," he said. "I didn't know I was doing it." She looked at him steadily. "Some part of you wasn't ready to finish," she said. He looked at the table. The worn wood of it, the rings from years of cups set down on it, the small knife mark near his side that he had made himself in his first year at Cinder Ridge and had never bothered to sand out. "I don't know what I was," he said. "I know what I did. I moved the chair back. I went into town. I didn't get on my horse." "And I was there," she said. "You were there." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I was afraid on that train in a way I haven't been afraid since I was a child. Not of dying, specifically, of being unfinished, of having left Philadelphia for something and not gotten to it, of the whole—" She stopped. "There were 6 letters, Gideon, 6 letters and a train ticket, and I was going to a place I'd never been to build a life with a person I had never touched. And I was on a burning train and I thought, I never even got to see the East Hill." He looked at her. "That was what I thought," she said. "Not about Philadelphia. Not about my brother or my life there or anything I was leaving behind. I thought, I never got to see whether the hill was real." The thing that was happening in his chest was not an easy thing. It was not a comfortable thing. It was the feeling of something long compressed being asked to expand, which always hurts before it doesn't. "It's real," he said. "I know that now," she said. They sat in the kitchen for a while longer without talking about anything in particular, which was a different kind of quiet than the quiet that had been in this kitchen before she came. Before, the quiet had been the sound of absence. This was the quiet of 2 people who had said enough and were resting in the having said it. At some point, Gideon got up and built the fire back up because the night had cooled and the rain was still making the air damp, and Lenora made more coffee because neither of them was going back to sleep for a while, and they sat at the kitchen table in the 2 in the morning way that is its own country, separate from the daytime world, where the rules about what you say and don't say are slightly different. She told him more about Philadelphia, the real version, not the edited one from the letters. She told him about the shop owner she'd worked for, a man named Ferris, who was meticulous and fair, but who had a way of reminding his employees of their replaceability every 6 months or so, not cruelly, just as a maintenance of a certain power arrangement that Lenora had accepted for 11 years and had spent the last 2 of them slowly understanding she would eventually leave. She told him about her brother's wife, who was kind in a way that had a ceiling to it, a warmth that extended exactly as far as family obligation required, and not a step further, which was fine, which was not personal, which Lenora had never quite made her peace with. She told him about the Sunday afternoons, not the way she'd described them in the letters, that narrow bedroom, that brick wall, but the specific texture of them, the particular feeling of the hours between 1 and 5 on a Sunday that she had never been able to fill in a way that felt adequate. The books she read, the walks she took, the work she sometimes brought home even though Ferris paid her not to. The feeling, she said, not of being lonely. She had been clear in the letters that she was not the kind of person who confused solitude with loneliness, but of being underused, like a tool kept clean and sharp in a drawer that didn't open often enough. You wrote about that, he said, something large enough to be worth failing at. Yes. Is this large enough? She looked at him across the table. The night was still dark outside, the rain reduced to a drip off the eaves. The lamp had burned low, and neither of them had turned it up. It's the largest thing I've ever tried, she said. Not just the ranch, all of it. This. She moved her hand slightly, a gesture that seemed to encompass the table between them, the house around them, the whole complicated construction of a life being made between two people with histories. I've never been good at this particular kind of large. What kind? The kind that requires you to be known, she said. I'm good at doing things. I'm good at solving problems. I'm decent at most of the practical requirements of being in proximity to other people. But being known, she paused. That's different. You have to hand someone the inventory of yourself and trust them not to use it to make you smaller. He looked at her. I know that, he said. I know you know it, she said. That's why I'm telling you. Outside, a sound. One of the horses shifting in the barn, a hoof on the barn floor. A sound so ordinary and familiar that he had stopped consciously hearing it years ago. It came through now, present, grounding. I'm not good at it either, he said. Being known. I've been hiding the inventory for a long time. I know that too, she said. I've seen the inventory anyway, pieces of it. She picked up her cup, found it empty, set it down. It's a good inventory for what it's worth. He looked at the lamp. I'm going to keep waking up at night, he said, for a while. I'm not going to be able to stop that right away. I know, she said. And when I do, I might come to the kitchen. Then come to the kitchen, she said. I'm a light sleeper. I'll probably be here already. He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she'd had at him on the train platform, the one that wasn't quite there, but that left a mark anyway. The woman on the train, he said, with the bag. Yes? Did she get out? Lenora looked at the table. Yes, she said. She did. A beat. She was very difficult to move, but she got out. He nodded. They stayed at the table until the rain stopped completely, which was around 4 in the morning, and then the sky began the slow gray process of becoming morning, which in the territory was a long process, a gradual lightening that came from the east first and moved across the land at its own unhurried pace. They could see it beginning through the kitchen window, the darkness going from black to deep blue to the particular pale gray that came before color. Lenora stood up first. She collected the cups and put them at the wash basin and said, The south field needs water checked before the heat. And he said, I know. And she went back to the bedroom to get dressed, and he sat at the table for a few more minutes watching the light come up over the east hill. The hill was a gray shape in the early light. Then, as the sun began to clear the far ridge, it caught the wet grass, and for a moment, just a moment, the whole hill was lit with a silver gold quality that he had never seen before, the rain wet adding a brightness to the ordinary gold that he hadn't anticipated and couldn't have predicted. He sat there and watched it. After a moment, he heard Lenora come back into the kitchen behind him. She stopped. He could tell, from the quality of the silence, that she was seeing the hill. They watched it together without speaking until the moment passed, the light settling into ordinary morning as the sun rose further and the silver burned off the grass and the day became the day. You should have seen it in the second letter, he said. I think I did, she said. I just didn't know what I was seeing yet. She went to start the morning. He sat for another few seconds at the table, and then he got up too because the cattle needed water checked, and the south fence still had a post that needed resetting 2 down from the one he'd fixed, and Lenora's garden would need him to carry water from the barrel while the pump was acting slow, and the morning was the morning, and it needed what mornings needed. He moved through the kitchen with his hat and his coat. At the door he paused. The telegram was upstairs, in the drawer of the nightstand where he'd put it the night before she arrived, meaning to deal with it and not dealing with it, not taking it out anymore, but not doing anything else with it either. Just sitting there in the dark of the drawer, folded into its soft, worn shape. He thought about it for a moment. Then he went out into the morning. Some things, he was learning, could wait. Not forever, but for the right moment, which was not always the moment you thought it would be. The day opened up over Cinder Ridge the way days do when the rain has passed, with a clarity that makes everything look slightly new, the colors more themselves, the shapes cleaner. Lenora was already at the garden when he came through the yard, crouching at the rows, checking what the night's rain had done to the soil, her hat on and her sleeves rolled and the scar on her arm catching the early light, the same way everything else did, part of the inventory of a woman who had survived more than one thing and was out here in the morning checking on her garden because it was the thing that needed doing next. He went to check the Southfield water. She stayed at the garden. Neither of them looked back. The summer of 1882 was the driest anyone in the territory could remember since the early 70s, and by July the creek where Lenora had gone looking for irises had dropped to a thin thread of itself, barely covering the stones at the crossing. The cattle needed moving to the north pasture where the grass was still holding, and the garden required water carried by hand every morning, and the days were long and hot, and full of the particular grinding work that a dry summer demanded from everyone who had anything living to protect. Gideon and Lenora worked through it the way they worked through most things by now, side by side, without much ceremony, dividing what needed doing by who was better positioned to do it at any given moment rather than by any fixed arrangement. She had stopped asking him where tools were kept sometime in June. He had stopped being surprised by how much she could carry sometime in May. The edges of their separate habits had been worn down enough by daily contact that what remained was something more functional than what either of them had brought to it alone, though neither of them would have described it in those terms out loud. What had changed, quietly, since the night of the rain, and the kitchen table, and the 2 in the morning telling of things, was a texture in the daily life between them that hadn't been there before. It wasn't dramatic, it didn't announce itself. It was more like the difference between a door that sticks slightly every time and a door that opens clean. You stop bracing for resistance that isn't there anymore, and the absence of the brace is itself a kind of relief. Gideon still woke in the night sometimes, but the waking had changed. Before he would lie in the dark, and his mind would run the old calculations, the ones that ended at the telegram, at Eleanor's grave, at every piece of evidence the past had provided that the future was a thing that could be taken without warning. Now when he woke, he lay still for a moment, and he could hear the house the way it actually sounded, the creak of the walls, the sound of the night wind, and underneath all of it, from down the hall, the quiet and ordinary rhythm of another person breathing. Not always enough to hear precisely, but enough to know. And knowing was enough. He would lie there for a few minutes, and then he would go back to sleep, and this had happened often enough now that it no longer felt fragile. Lenora's nighttime milk had become an occasional thing rather than a regular one. She slept better out here than she had in Philadelphia, she said once, without elaborating, and he believed her because it showed in her face, which had lost the particular tight quality it had carried when she arrived, the look of someone living at a slightly higher tension than they would choose. She had not stopped missing Philadelphia. He knew that. She didn't say it in so many words, but she didn't need to. He knew her well enough now to read the moments when something caught her, when a smell or a sound or the particular quality of a Tuesday afternoon brought up the life she had left and held it alongside this one for a moment of comparison. He had learned not to ask about it when he saw it happening, because asking turned private reckoning into performance, and she didn't want that, and he understood not wanting that because he didn't want it either. What he had started to understand, watching her through the summer, was that missing a place wasn't the same as wanting to return to it, and wanting something better didn't erase the fact that what you left behind had been real. She had loved certain things about her life in Philadelphia. She had loved the library 2 streets from her apartment. She had loved the sound of the city in early morning before it fully woke. She had loved her work, specifically the precision and the problem-solving of it, in ways that Ferris's shop had only partially accommodated. These things were real, and they were hers, and she didn't owe anyone an apology for carrying them. He was learning, this summer, that love of one thing doesn't cancel another. That a person can be fully committed to where they are and still grieve the geography of where they were. He was learning this from watching Lenora, and it was teaching him something about himself that he had been circling for years without landing on it. That his years of keeping the ranch, his meticulous commitment to Cinder Ridge, had been real love for this land and this work, and it had existed alongside grief for Eleanor, and neither one had canceled the other, and he had spent years feeling as though they should. It was an obvious thing, the kind of thing a person might tell you directly, and you would nod at and not quite believe until you saw it in someone else's life, and it became undeniable. In August, 3 things happened that between them completed something that had been building since April. The first was the arrival of a letter from Lenora's brother. His name was Daniel Vance, and he was 4 years older than Lenora and lived in Maryland with his wife and 2 children, and he had written to Lenora's Philadelphia address sometime in late June. And the letter had been forwarded twice and arrived at Cinder Ridge 6 weeks after it was sent, water-stained at one corner and smelling faintly of the postal system's indignities. Lenora read it at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, and Gideon was at the stove, and he heard the quality of her silence change partway through the letter, and he looked at her. She was not crying. Lenora did not cry easily, which he had noted without judgment, but her face had a tightness in it that he associated with things landing harder than she'd expected. "He didn't know where I was," she said when she'd finished. "How do you mean?" "He thought I was still in Philadelphia. He went to write to me at the shop address, and Ferris told him I'd left months ago, and he didn't have my forwarding address." She set the letter down. "He's been writing to Philadelphia for 2 months. Did he not know about the matrimonial arrangement?" "I told him," she said, "in February, before I wrote to the agency. I told him I was considering it." She was quiet for a moment. "He said at the time that it seemed like a large decision to make based on limited information, and that he hoped I was being careful." "And then?" "And then I wrote and told him I was going, and he wrote back that he hoped things would go well, and I wrote from Indiana when the train stopped, the regular stop, before the fire, and then there was no letter from me after that." She looked at the letter. He thought something had happened. Gideon came to the table and sat down across from her. "Something did happen," he said. He didn't know what. She picked the letter up again, looking at one particular section near the end. "He says he contacted the railway authority in late July. They told him there had been a passenger fatality and a fire on the April route with a name similar to mine. He says he spent 3 weeks trying to get clarification." She put the letter down flat on the table. "He thought I was dead." Gideon looked at her. He knew exactly what her brother had felt for those 3 weeks, with a precision that went all the way down. "Write to him today," Gideon said. "I was going to. Write to him today and tell him everything. The fire, the delay, the mix-up with the manifest, all of it. And tell him—" He stopped. She looked at him. "Tell him to come," Gideon said. "If he wants to. He can come and see it for himself." She looked at him steadily. "You'd want that? A stranger in the house?" "He's not a stranger," Gideon said. "He's your brother." Something moved through her face. Well, not the almost smile, something more than that. Something fuller and less guarded than he usually saw from her. It lasted only a moment, and then she had it contained again, but he saw it. "He has a family," she said. "He can't just—" "I know he has a family," Gideon said. "I didn't say he had to come tomorrow. I said tell him he's welcome. Those are different things." She looked at him for another moment. "All right," she said. She wrote to Daniel Vance that afternoon, a long letter by her standards, and Gideon left her to it and went out to the barn, and when he came back 2 hours later, the letter was sealed and addressed on the kitchen table, and Lenora was making supper with the focused quietness of someone who has done something they needed to do and is now back on solid ground. The second thing that happened in August was the blizzard warning. It came early. Too early, the middle of August, which was wrong by any normal reckoning, but the territory had its own calendar and it kept it independent of human expectation. The warning came through haze at the telegraph office, a relay from the weather station 300 miles north. Temperatures dropping 40 degrees in 36 hours, heavy snow possible, visibility near zero. The kind of storm that killed livestock and caught unprepared families flat. Gideon got the warning on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon he had ridden to 3 neighboring properties, and Lenora had driven the wagon to 2 more. And by Thursday evening there was an impromptu meeting at the Purvis farm of 7 homesteaders within range of Cinder Ridge, all of them with the slightly taut faces of people calculating how exposed they were. The Hadley family was the most vulnerable. Young couple, he was 26, she was 24, with a baby not yet walking, their homestead the furthest out, their winter stores not fully established. They had arrived in the territory 8 months ago with more optimism than experience, which was not a character flaw but was a practical liability in front of an early blizzard. Lenora had met Sarah Hadley twice in Drywater Crossing and once at the Faro place. She sat across from her now in Walt Purvis's front room and watched the younger woman doing the arithmetic of the situation and not arriving at reassuring numbers. "You come to Cinder Ridge," Lenora said. Everyone in the room looked at her. "The storm will last, what, 2 days?" She looked at Gideon. "3 at the outside," he said. "Then you come to us for 3 days. Bring the baby and what you need for the baby, and your livestock can shelter in our barn. We have room." She looked around at the other faces in the room. "And anyone else whose situation is thin, same offer." Walt Purvis said, "That's a considerable number of people, Lenora." "I can count," she said. "The house has space, and we have stores, and the barn is large. What else would we do with it?" It wasn't a question. Gideon looked at her across the room. She was not performing generosity. She was solving a problem the way she solved all problems, by assessing what was available and deploying it toward what was needed, without making a production of the deployment. He had seen her do it a dozen times by now. It still struck him every time as one of the most fundamental things about her. "She's right," he said. "Come to Cinder Ridge." In the end, 3 families came. The Hadleys with their baby, a widower named Crane, whose place was furthest north and whose age made the isolation a genuine risk, and the Faro family, whose barn had a structural problem that Gideon had noticed in June and that would not hold under heavy snow load without help. They arrived on Friday as the sky was turning the particular flat gray-white that preceded serious weather, bringing children and animals and supplies and the slightly overwhelmed energy of people in a situation they hadn't planned for. Cinder Ridge, which had been a house for one for 7 years and had been a house for 2 for the past 4 months, became, in the space of about 3 hours, a house for 11 people and a barn for 14 additional animals. It was not graceful. The house was not designed for 11 people. Sleeping arrangements were improvised and imperfect. The kitchen ran continuous shifts. Sargent, confronted with the Faro children, retired to the hayloft with the air of a creature who has limits and has reached them and is not apologizing for it. But the storm came in on Friday night exactly as forecast, a wall of wind and snow that hit the territory like something with a grievance. And by Saturday morning, Cinder Ridge was surrounded by white, and the temperature had dropped to a place where 15 minutes outside required serious preparation. And inside the house, there were 11 people keeping each other warm by virtue of proximity and shared necessity. Lenora ran it, not by declaring herself in charge, not by organizing a hierarchy or making announcements. She simply moved through the situation the way she moved through all situations, seeing what was needed and addressing it before it became a problem. And people naturally oriented toward her because she always knew what was happening and where things were and who needed what. She and Sarah Hadley managed the kitchen together. The baby, whose name was Edmund and who had strong opinions about most things, was passed between whoever had a free arm, which eventually included Gideon, who held the child with the careful, slightly rigid posture of a man who has not held a baby in a very long time and is not entirely sure of the technique. Edmund seemed untroubled by the technique and fell asleep against Gideon's shoulder inside of 10 minutes, which surprised Gideon and seemed to amuse Lenora considerably, though she said nothing about it at the time. The old widower Crane, who had been in the territory for 30 years and had opinions about everything the territory had produced in that time, sat at the kitchen table on Saturday afternoon and watched Lenora organizing the food situation with the particular attention of someone revising a prior assessment. "You're not what I expected," he said, when she paused near him to take something from the shelf. She looked at him. "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd last one winter and go home," he said. Not unkindly, just directly, the old man's privilege of saying what he thought. "A lot of people expected that," she said. "And?" She looked at him. "I'm still here." "I see that." He turned his cup in his hands. "You're also the reason I'm not spending this storm alone in a house with a bad chimney, which I was prepared to do and which would have been, in hindsight, a poor decision." "It would have been a very poor decision," she said, with the same flatness she used for most truths. He made a sound that was approximately a laugh and drank his coffee. The storm ran through Saturday and into Sunday morning, and by Sunday afternoon the wind had dropped and the snow had stopped and the sky came back as that particular intense blue that follows serious weather in the territory, the kind of blue that looks like an apology. The road to Drywater Crossing was buried but not impassably so, and by Monday the families began making their way home, the Farrows first, then Crane, then the Hadleys last. Sarah Hadley standing in the yard with Edmund on her hip and looking at Lenora with the specific expression of someone who doesn't quite have words for what they're feeling but is going to try anyway. "I don't know how to," she started. "You don't need to," Lenora said. "I do, though." Sarah looked down at the baby. "We weren't ready. We knew we weren't ready, and we came out here anyway because we thought we'd figure it out, and that's—" She stopped. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did," Lenora said. "What else would I have done?" Sarah Hadley looked at her for a moment. Then she reached out and took Lenora's hand and held it briefly, and Lenora let her, and then Sarah took Edmund and her husband and their horse and started the road home, and Lenora stood in the yard of Cinder Ridge watching them go. Gideon came and stood beside her. The yard was deep in snow. The east hill beyond was entirely white except for the dark lines of the fence posts and the cattle moving on the far slope where the wind had scoured the surface down to passable grazing. The sky was the post-storm blue. The air was cold and completely still. The particular stillness that comes after something violent has spent itself. "The barn held," he said. "I know," she said. "I checked it an hour ago. The roof on the south side needs work before next winter." "I know that too." He looked at the hill. "You did something here this weekend," he said. She glanced at him. "We did." "You organized it." "Someone had to." "I know. I'm not arguing with you." He looked at her. "I'm telling you what I saw." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the snow-covered yard. "The Hadley girl is going to be all right," she said. "She learns fast and she doesn't pretend she knows things she doesn't. Those are the two things you need." "Like someone else I know," he said. She looked at him with the expression she used when she was deciding whether something counted as sentiment and whether she was going to permit it. She let it pass. "The third porch step needs checking after the ice," she said. "The repair might not have held." "I'll check it," he said. They went inside. The third thing that happened in August was smaller than the storm and larger than either of them in ways that took time to understand. It was the last week of August, a Tuesday evening, the summer still warm enough that the kitchen was hot with cooking and the door was open to let the air move through. Lenora was at the table with the canvas project she'd been working on, an improved design for the winter feed covers, the fourth iteration, each one better than the last. And Gideon was at the stove and the light was the long golden light of late August evenings that makes everything it touches look like it's been there forever. He had been thinking about the drawer all day, not obsessively, not in the way he'd thought about the telegram in those first weeks when it was against his chest. But the telegram was in the drawer of the nightstand still, where he'd put it the night before Lenora arrived, and it had been there for 4 months. And what had felt in June like something that needed the right moment was now beginning to feel like something he was avoiding rather than waiting on. He knew the difference. He'd learned it this summer. He turned from the stove. "I want to do something," he said. "Tonight." She looked up from the canvas. "The telegram," he said. She put the canvas down. "I've been leaving it in the drawer," he said. "I kept thinking I'd know when the time was right, and I think I've been using that as a reason not to deal with it." She looked at him steadily. "What do you want to do with it?" "I want to get rid of it," he said. "I want to—" He stopped. Started again. "I don't want to keep it in this house." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. "Get it." He went upstairs. The drawer opened the way it always opened, the slight resistance at the left side where the wood had swollen in the summer heat. He reached in and found the telegram by feel, which he could do because he knew exactly where it was and had known exactly where it was for 4 months, even though he hadn't touched it. He brought it downstairs. He held it out to her. She took it. She unfolded it the same way she had on the train platform in April, the careful unfolding of someone who knows what they're about to read and is not in a hurry. She read it. He watched her read his name on it, her name, the date, the words. She folded it closed again. "Do you want to say something about it first?" she said. "Or just, he said. She went to the stove. She opened the firebox. The fire was running moderate, enough for the evening cooking, not banked yet. She held the telegram in her hand over the opening, and she looked at him. "You do it," he said. She handed it to him. He held it at the edge of the firebox. The paper was soft. He knew how soft it was, had known it for months. And in the heat from the opening, it moved slightly, a small trembling at the corner like something alive. He put it in. It caught immediately, not dramatically. Paper burns the way paper burns, fast and with a brief bright flame, and then dark, and then ash. In about 4 seconds it was gone. Not the way things in stories burn, with meaning and significance expanding into the air around them. Just gone. Paper becoming heat, becoming nothing, the way all paper does eventually, the way all things do. He closed the firebox. He stood there for a moment. Lenora was beside him, close enough that her shoulder was near his arm, which was the closest she'd voluntarily stood to him in the months since she arrived, without task or purpose requiring proximity, just there. "How does that feel?" she said. He thought about it honestly, the way she'd taught him to answer her questions. "Lighter," he said, "than I expected and less than I hoped." "That's honest," she said. "I don't feel fixed," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know you're not fixed," she said. "I'm not fixed either. We're just less encumbered than we were." He looked at the closed firebox. "It doesn't change what happened," he said. "No," she said. "It changes what we're building around it." He looked at her. She was looking at the stove, at the closed iron door of the firebox, and her face was serious and settled and present in the way her face was when she had arrived at a decision and was at peace with it. The scar on her arm caught the stove light. Her hair was doing what it always did by evening, escaping from wherever she'd put it that morning, several pieces loose around her face. He had a thought that he would not have known how to have 4 months ago, could not have found the language for, would not have trusted himself to say even if he'd had the language, that she was not Eleanor. Not Eleanor's replacement, not a corrective for that loss, not a second attempt at the same thing. She was Lenora Vance, completely and specifically herself, with her Philadelphia precision and her direct questions and her fierce practicality and her particular way of seeing things that cut past the performance of them to whatever was actually there. He had not found another Eleanor. He had found someone entirely different, and the difference was not a compromise. It was the thing itself. He had been afraid, he understood now, not just of losing her, though that fear had been real and was still real and probably always would be, but of the specific vulnerability of loving someone new, someone who was not covered by the grief he already knew how to carry. Eleanor's loss had its place in him, worn into shape by years of carrying it. But Lenora was new. Loving Lenora was new. And new love had no grooves worn into it, no established path, nothing to hold on to if it broke. It was the most exposed you could be, choosing to love something that had no protection yet. That was the thing he hadn't been able to name. All those nights, all those times he'd been at the window or the barn door or engineering reasons to check the creek crossing. Not just fear of loss, fear of the rawness of new love, the way it left you open in places that had been closed and protected for years. You couldn't protect against it by watching. You couldn't seal it against the possible future by accounting for her whereabouts every hour. It was just there, wide open, and the only thing to do with it was be in it. He understood this now. He wasn't sure what to do with understanding it except continue, which was what he had been doing, which was probably the right answer. "Lenora," he said. She looked at him. "I want to marry you properly," he said. "I know what this has been," she said. "We've been living together on a ranch as though we're married without being married." "Yes." "Which is irregular by any standard." "Yes." "And you want to remedy the irregularity." He looked at her. "I want to marry you," he said. "That's not the same as remedying an irregularity, and you know that." She held his gaze for a moment. There was something in her expression that he couldn't quite read, which happened less frequently now than it used to, but still happened. "You're not asking me because it's the proper thing to do," she said. Not a question. Checking. "No," he said. "You're asking me because you want to." "Yes." Even knowing, she stopped. She seemed to be choosing. "Even knowing that I'm not easy, that I have opinions about everything, and I'm particular about the organization of the barn, and I wake up at 2 in the morning sometimes, and I miss Philadelphia in ways I don't always tell you about." "Yes," he said, "knowing all of that. Because of all of that." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet around them, the late summer evening coming through the open door with the smell of dry grass, and the distant sound of the cattle on the hill. "You know what you're asking for," she said. "I know what I'm asking for," he said. "I've been living next to it for 4 months." The corner of her mouth did the thing that had been almost a smile on the train platform in April, and had been increasingly less, almost, and more itself as the months had gone by. It was nearly a real smile now, not a large one. That was not her style, but real. All the way to real. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, as though the first time might not have been clear enough. They married on a Saturday in late September, under the cottonwood trees near the ranch house, where the afternoon light came through the leaves in the particular broken gold of early fall. It was not a large wedding. Walt and Clara Purvis were there, and the Farrow family, and old Crane, who dressed for the occasion in a coat that suggested better decades and wore it with complete dignity. The Hadleys came with Edmund, who had developed opinions about being put down and communicated them throughout the ceremony with no concern for timing. Hayes came from the telegraph office, standing slightly apart from the other guests with the careful guilt of a young man who still felt responsible for a telegram that had not been his fault. And Lenora caught his eye at one point during the ceremony and gave him a small direct nod that appeared to relieve him of some portion of that guilt. There was no minister. Gideon had arranged for a justice of the peace from Drywater Crossing, a practical man named Olson, who had performed enough frontier ceremonies to know that what people wanted was something real and not too long. It was real and not too long. When Olson said the words that made it legal and looked at Gideon, Gideon said what he was supposed to say. And then Olson looked at Lenora, and she said what she was supposed to say in a voice that was steady and direct and entirely her own, without performance, without sentiment painted over the top of things, just the truth of it said out loud in front of people. Clara Purvis cried. This surprised everyone present, and Clara herself most of all. Afterward, in the yard, Walt shook Gideon's hand and said, "You did all right for a man who doesn't know how to need anything." And Gideon said, "I had help." And Walt said, "I know, that's the point," and moved off to find his wife. Old Crane stood near the cottonwood a while longer, looking at the ranch with the long-seen eyes of a man who had watched this territory for 30 years and understood what it took to make something last here. "You know what this place looked like when I came through 8 years ago?" he said to Gideon. "I can imagine," Gideon said. "Just a house," Crane said. "Good house. Solid, but just a house. You can tell the difference." He looked at Lenora, who was across the yard holding Edmund while Sarah Hadley ate something with both hands for the first time in the afternoon. A house and a home are different things, and most people confuse them. Gideon looked at the ranch, the solid plain front of it, the barn, the garden that was going in for its second season, the canvas covers on the winter feed, the fourth and best iteration, the porch with its repaired third step, the kitchen window with its jar of dried creek flowers, the irises from June gone now, but something else in their place, something Lenora had found at the edge of the north pasture and thought worth keeping. "Yes," he said. "I know the difference now." The afternoon ran long and easy the way fall afternoons do in good weather, and people stayed later than they'd planned because staying was pleasant and the company was comfortable, and Lenora had made things to eat that were better than what most of these people produced in their own kitchens, which she knew and did not mention. When everyone had finally gone and the yard was quiet and the cottonwood leaves were catching the last of the light, Gideon and Lenora stood on the porch together and looked at the east hill. The fall had changed it. The grass was drying to gold, the real gold, not the spring green he'd described in the second letter, different from what he'd told her about. Not better or worse, different. The hill in September was its own thing, longer shadows, the color more amber than yellow, the shapes of it slightly harder in the crisper air. "It's not what you described," she said. "No," he said. "It changes every season." "You didn't tell me that." "You didn't ask." She looked at the hill. "I'll see it in winter?" "White," he said, "almost flat. You lose the shape of it until the snow starts to melt." "And spring?" "Green early, muddy at the base for the first month." "And next summer?" He looked at her. "Gold again," he said. "Dry gold, same as you saw when you arrived." She was quiet for a moment. "That's 4 seasons," she said. "That's how many there are," he said. She looked at the hill for a while longer. Sargent appeared from inside the house and sat between them on the porch boards with the air of a cat who has decided that this is a significant occasion and is willing to be present for it, provided no one makes any sudden movements. "I was afraid of one thing," she said. "When I was on the burning train, aside from dying, I mean, aside from the practical fear of the situation." He waited. "I was afraid," she said, "that I had finally decided to try something worth trying and I wasn't going to get to find out how it went." He looked at the hill with her. "How is it going?" he said. She thought about it. He liked that she thought about it rather than answering immediately. She was not the kind of person who said things to be kind. She said things because they were true, and the pause meant she was finding the true thing rather than the easy thing. "It's hard," she said. "Some of it is very hard. The isolation is harder than I thought it would be, and the winters are going to be harder still. And I have opinions about things that you don't always want my opinions about, and you go quiet in ways that I can't always read. And we are two grown people with 30-plus years of separate habits apiece, trying to build something neither of us has a template for." She paused. "And?" he said. "And it's the thing I was looking for," she said. "It's large enough. It's—" She stopped. She seemed for a moment to be looking for the word that was actually true rather than the word that sounded right. "It's worth being afraid to lose," she said. He had said something like that to himself once. Not in those words, not out loud. But the idea that the measure of a thing was the fear of its loss, he had turned that over in himself in the dark of many nights, the nights before she came and the nights after. He had been wrong about it, or not entirely right. The fear of losing something was real, and it was in proportion to the value of the thing, and that much was true. But it wasn't the measure of a life. You couldn't live by the metric of what you were afraid to lose because that was another form of the hiding he'd been doing for 7 years. Circling the thing you valued from the outside, never quite touching it, because touching it confirmed how much it would cost you to lose it. What he'd learned this year was that the measure was the opposite. Not what you feared to lose. What you chose to build, knowing you might lose it. Those were different stances toward the same fact of human vulnerability, and only one of them was actually living. He had been choosing, slowly, imperfectly, throughout this whole strange year. He had chosen to write the letters. He had chosen not to get on his horse when the train came in. He had chosen to pick up Lenora's trunk. He had chosen to tell her the things he told her at 2 a.m. in the rainy kitchen. He had chosen to put the telegram in the fire. He had chosen to ask her to marry him on a Tuesday evening in a hot kitchen that smelled like the canvas she was working on. None of these choices had protected him from the possibility of loss. He knew that clearly. The world was what it had always been, indifferent and enormous and capable of telegram-swift cruelty without warning. Eleanor was still gone. The fire had been real. The wrong name on the manifest had been real. The 5 days of grief had been real. But he was here, on this porch, with this woman who had come 4 days late on a delayed train with a burned arm and a battered trunk, and had, in 4 months, made his ranch into a different thing than it had ever been before. Not better in the way that fixed things are better in the way that alive things are better. Complicated and imperfect and ongoing and fully, genuinely alive. He reached out and took her hand. She looked down at their hands. Then she looked at him, and her expression was the most open he had ever seen it, which was not all the way open. She was not that kind of person, and he did not want her to be. But open enough. Open past the careful management of it. Open in the specific way that comes from deciding that a person has earned the sight of you. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. The east hill held the last of the light. The cattle moved on the far slope with their slow, particular purpose. Somewhere in the barn, 14 feet from the porch, Sargent had returned to his preferred corner, restored to the solitude he required, his attendance at the ceremony complete and adequate. The fall evening came down over Cinder Ridge the way it had come down every evening for the years Gideon had spent here alone. The same sky, the same distances, the same enormous and indifferent dark arriving from the east. But the porch light was on. The kitchen window with its jar of dried flowers was lit from inside. 2 coffee cups would be on the table in the morning. The third step held. The telegram was ash, and Gideon Rusk, who had spent 7 years learning to live without anyone, stood on the porch of the life. He had finally stopped being afraid to build, holding the hand of the woman who had been on a burning train and arrived 4 days late, and walked into a house not yet ready for her and made it ready by living in it, and understood at last what he had not been able to understand before. Courage was not surviving the loss. Courage was deciding, after the loss, to put something in the fire that had been taking up the drawer. Courage was leaving the chair at the table. Courage was not getting on the horse. Courage was all the small ordinary choosing, day after day, to build something you knew you could lose, because the alternative, protecting yourself so completely that nothing could reach you, was not safety. It was just a different kind of gone. He knew that now. He was done being gone.